will now come to order. Today's subcommittee is holding a hearing entitled Legislative Hearing to Strengthen Energy Infrastructure Efficiency and Financing. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, members can participate in today's hearing either in person or remotely via online video conferencing. In accordance with the updated guidance issued by the attending physician, members, staff, and members of the press present in the hearing room are not required to wear a mask. For members participating remotely, your microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members participating remotely will need to unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. Please note that once you unmute your microphone, anything that is in Webex will be heard over the loudspeakers in the committee room and subject to being heard by live stream and C-SPAN. Given that members are participating from different locations at today's hearing, all recognition of members, such as for questions, will be in the order of subcommittee seniority. Documents for the record can be sent to Lino Pina Martinez at the email address we provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at conclusion of the hearing. The chair now recognizes himself for an opening statement. I would like to welcome our witnesses for today's hearing. Andrew Delasky, Executive Director of Appliance Standards Awareness Project. Richard Rico Frias, Executive Director, Native American Finance Officers Association. Thank you for coming. Dustin Mulvaney, PhD, Professor, Environmental Studies, San Jose State University. Joshua C. Green, Corporate Vice President, Government and Industry Affairs, A.O. Smith Corporation. Lucian Pugliese, President, Energy Policy Research Foundation. Ben Lieberman, Senior Fellow, Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. Oh, where is it? Okay, now for my opening statement. Good morning. Today we will be holding a legislative hearing on 6 bills authored by members from both sides of the aisle, focused on updates and upgrades to our nation's energy infrastructure. As the U.S. and the rest of the world undergoes the energy transition necessary to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, it's crucial that our existing system be able to adapt to meeting our evolving needs. The 6 bills present modest changes to federal programs to make operations smoother and better able to meet the needs of energy consumers and developers. 2 of today's bills focus on increasing energy efficiency of homes and appliances, which will be essential for decreasing our energy demand and lowering monthly energy costs for Americans. Another 2 of the bills make reforms to the way federal government finances energy infrastructure, which would improve accessibility and accountability of federal loan programs. And 2 of the bills address the reliability of our energy systems, which continues to be imperiled by climate disasters, supply chain issues, cyber and physical vulnerabilities, and aging assets. These bills represent a common sense approach to reforming our energy laws, and I look forward to hearing what our witnesses have to say about them. First up is H.R. 1599, Securing America's Critical Minerals Supply Act, authored by our ranking member, Mr. Upton. Critical minerals are essential to the growth of renewable energy resources, and onshoring the supply chain will both increase the availability of components and support domestic jobs. This bill draws attention to that need as energy transition evolves. We will also discuss H.R. 8053, a bipartisan bill from Congressman Crow, Peters, and Bacon. This bill allows the Department of Energy to enter into contracts or agreements to improve our resilience of portions of our electrical infrastructure that are critical to our national defense and to reduce the vulnerability of this infrastructure. In my opinion, this should be a non-controversial bill which will allow us to enhance our national security by making long-term commitments to energy reliability, serving our military installations without overburdening nearby tax ratepayers. Next up, we have two bills focused on energy efficiency. H.R. 7947 from the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee's Chairman Paul Tonko, this subcommittee's Chairman Bobby Rush, and the Chairwoman of the Energy and Water Appropriations Subcommittee, Marcy Kaptur, and H.R. 7962, offered by Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. Mr. Tonko's Weatherization, Enhancement, and Readiness Act would strengthen the Weatherization Assistance Program by raising the cap that limits how much assistance households can receive to account for increasing in the prices of building materials, and by ensuring that the households that could most benefit from weatherization programs are able to participate. This program has provided important services for our low-income households for decades, and the proposed changes can ensure that the program continues to be accessible for years to come. Ms. Dingell's bipartisan bill touches on the water-energy nexus by harmonizing energy efficiency standards for commercial and residential water heaters, by improving the resilience of our grid, by creating a demand response program for residential water heaters. It would also require the Department of Energy to issue a rule by the end of 2024 requiring that electric water heaters have demand response capabilities as long as that requirement is technologically feasible and economically justified. In considering this bill, I hope that we take note of one of the many ways in which energy and water are intertwined and how energy use is embedded in the water-related appliances in our homes. These bills are two great ideas that will help reduce the strain on our grid while delivering electricity to our homes and appliances. Finally, we have two bills that would make common sense tweaks to our loan program office within the Department of Energy. The first is the bill from our late colleague, Don Young of Alaska, H.R. 5292, the Energy Accountability Act. If enacted, it would mandate that any borrower that has previously defaulted on a Title 17 loan be barred from receiving any other loan guarantees under the program. Secondly, H.R. 8068, a bipartisan bill from Ms. Ledger Fernandez and this subcommittee's own Mr. Halloran, improves the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program by allowing the Department of Energy to issue loans directly, revitalizing a program that has not been able to issue a single loan in 17 years. I want to thank the authors of the bills we are discussing today and their staffs for their hard work and the hard work yet to come. This is the start of a journey on these bills, not the end. I look forward to the feedback that our witnesses are able to provide today. I have a letter here from Dr. Ali Nouri, Assistant Secretary of Congressional Intergovernmental Affairs of the Department of Energy. I request unanimous consent to enter the following letter from the Department of Energy into the record. Without objection, so ordered. And with that, I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Upton, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you, my friend, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for appearing before us to provide their testimony. Mr. Chairman, the U.S. is plunging deeper and deeper into an energy crisis, driven by roaring inflation, anti-fossil fuel policies, demand shocks across the country. Our constituents are rightly concerned about the lack of leadership. The annual inflation rate in May, as we know, was 8.6%, the highest level since 1981. Gasoline is averaging $5, with drivers in California and other states paying over $6, getting close to $7. More than half of the nation is going to be elevated risk for power outages this summer, even perhaps this weekend, as reliable baseload power generation is retired in favor of weather-dependent green alternatives like wind and solar. God help us when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. The bills before us today are not going to alleviate the pain that Americans are feeling at the pump or reduce the risk of blackouts. And while this is supposed to be a legislative hearing, the DOE is not here to provide their testimony. Republicans on this side of the aisle have been sounding the alarm since day one. Energy prices surged following the president's cancellation of Keystone XL pipeline on day one and the moratorium on federal leasing. Gas prices went up even further as the EPA and FERC began to tighten the screws on infrastructure permitting. But instead of addressing the energy crisis head-on, the president's traveling to ask Saudi Arabia to ask OPEC and Russia for more oil. Members of this committee should hear from energy producers on what it will take to produce more oil here at home. I'm concerned by what appears to be a naive understanding of the scope and scale of the energy crisis and what is required to address it. Contrary to the rhetoric from the White House and DOE, high gas prices will not encourage Americans to buy more expensive electric vehicles. Residential electricity prices are also increasing at record pace, and China is consolidating its control over more than 90% of critical minerals used in batteries and solar panels. If we don't reinvigorate our domestic mining industry, we are going to see more spikes in raw materials like lithium that's going to drive up costs even more for consumers. I was pleased to see my bill, H.R. 1599, Securing America's Critical Minerals Supply Act, included in today's legislative hearing. This bill is going to build on DOE's energy security mission by providing tools for DOE to secure a reliable domestic supply of critical energy resources, including critical materials. We can't trade away the energy security America has achieved through the domestic production of coal, oil, or natural gas for Chinese batteries and solar panels. It's a national security imperative that we produce the energy that we need right here at home. It's really simple. Turning to the other bills on the docket, I am supportive, certainly, of H.R. 5292, the Energy Accountability Act introduced by our best buddy, Don Young of Alaska. Legislation is a good government bill that will disqualify companies like Solyndra, who defaulted on a loan from participating in DOE's loan guarantee program, and I would ask unanimous consent that his fine letter be entered into the record in support of that bill. Some of these bills will need more work, an additional hearing with DOE before they're ready to be marked up. I have questions about H.R. 8053, the GRID Act, which appears to build on DOE's program to protect critical defense infrastructure. Members of the committee should have the ability to question DOE on H.R. 7947 and H.R. 8053, which are bills that will modify DOE's weatherization program and appliance standards. It appears that both bills include new language that could have broad and far-reaching implications for taxpayers and consumers, and at the end of the day, they may not be terribly happy. For example, H.R. 8053 includes a new concept that would allow DOE to mandate demand response, which is capability that allows a grid operator to remotely monitor and control residential appliances to reduce electricity demand. I believe that that raises serious privacy concerns that, again, I don't think are going to go over very well with consumers. Each of the bills before us today deserves careful consideration from this subcommittee. I look forward to working with the majority to ensure regular order. With that, thanks again. Yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, chair of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman McNerney. Today, we're going to discuss legislation on a range of topics that affect our energy sectors, including energy supply chains, energy efficiency, weatherization, Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, and critical infrastructure. So first, the subcommittee will review two bills that improve energy efficiency and reduce energy costs for consumers. H.R. 7962, introduced by Representative Dingell, makes important changes to water heater efficiency standards and creates a new demand response program for residential water heaters. This legislation could have a significant impact on energy consumption, help consumers save on their energy bills, and help utilities reduce demand during peak times. It also contains common sense fixes that harmonize standards for residential and commercial water heaters. Then there's H.R. 7947, the Weatherization, Enhancement, and Readiness Act, introduced by Representatives Tonko, Rush, and Capter. It establishes an important new weatherization and readiness program, makes other practical changes to the Department of Energy's Weatherization Assistance Program. President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law, built on the bipartisan work we did in the Energy Act of 2020, investing a historic $3.5 billion in the Weatherization Assistance Program and reducing energy costs for over 700,000 low-income households. Still, many households are not able to receive weatherization improvements due to underlying structural and electrical issues. So this new Weatherization Readiness Program will ensure low-income families can make the upgrades necessary to enable them to qualify for weatherization measures, reduce their energy consumption, and save money on their bills. Then we have H.R. 1599, Securing America's Critical Mineral Supply Act, introduced by Ranking Member Upton. That requires DOE to conduct assessments and secure energy resources that have vulnerable supply chains. As we work to secure a resilient and clean energy sector, we have to make sure we're responsibly procuring critical minerals here in the U.S. And the BIF took important steps to support clean energy supply chains, and I'm eager to learn how this bill can advance our work towards a resilient, clean energy economy. We're also considering two bills to reform DOE's loan programs, H.R. 8068, the Tribal Energy Investment Act, which was introduced by Representatives Leger Fernandez, O'Halloran, and Cole. And this bill seeks to improve the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program, which permits DOE to provide loan guarantees to support energy development projects on tribal lands. But despite our best intentions in establishing that program in 2005, it has not financed a single project in the program's 17-year history. And that needs to change, obviously. So I look forward to hearing from the Native American Finance Officers Association about how the Tribal Energy Investment Act builds on the recent bipartisan effort included in the fiscal year 2022 appropriations package to unlock the promise of this essential program. Also look forward to discussing H.R. 5292, the Energy Accountability Act, sponsored by our late colleague, Representative Don Young. It would prohibit DOE from guaranteeing a loan for any entity that previously defaulted on an obligation guaranteed under Title 17 of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And finally, we have H.R. 8053, a bipartisan bill from Representatives Crow, Peters, and Bacon that amends the Federal Power Act to provide the Secretary of Energy authority to address vulnerabilities to the resilience of defense-critical electrical infrastructure. And this bill seeks to ensure that homes and businesses surrounding military installations do not bear the cost of electrical upgrades necessary for the security of those military bases. So I think these are all important bills that will help strengthen our domestic energy sector. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Rogers, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The need for President Biden to abandon his war on American energy is becoming more urgent by the day. People can't afford to fill up their gas tanks. Natural gas prices are surging. Because energy is foundational to every part of our lives. Everything's more expensive, especially food. We must flip the switch on American energy, produce more, and make life affordable again. This is clear to every American family as they confront record inflation and energy prices, declining electric reliability, blackout threats, and looming energy security threats from Russia's war on Ukraine. It's clear to domestic energy producers, manufacturers, and innovators as they struggle to attract capital to build and overcome permitting challenges, regulatory uncertainty, and China-controlled supply chains. To lower costs, President Biden must focus on removing the barriers to an American energy and economic resurgence. Tapping the SPR hasn't worked. A gas tax holiday will be ineffective and would undermine funding to infrastructure projects for road safety. More government spending has fueled the inflation crisis, and asking foreign dictators for more oil, like in Saudi Arabia, further weakens our security and prosperity. To secure our energy dominance and lower prices, the president must abandon this agenda that has led to his worsening energy crisis since day one. He must embrace policies that encourage investments in durable American energy and fuel the supply of goods and services into our economy. It means growing our tremendous energy systems, not dismantling them with rush-to-green policies that stifle innovation, undermine security, and raise energy costs. This should guide how we evaluate proposals concerning energy efficiency, energy infrastructure, and energy security. Today's hearing considers 6 bills on different policy topics. The common connection among them is the Department of Energy. Unfortunately, DOE is not here, and we will not be able to question DOE officials on these bills and the programs they address. I hope we have the chance soon. In the meantime, I welcome the opportunity for members to ask questions to stakeholders and other experts here. I'm pleased to see included Fred Upton's H.R. 1599, Securing America's Energy or Critical Mineral Supply Act, which is part of our Securing a Cleaner American Energy agenda. This bill establishes a cabinet-level focus on identifying the critical energy resources necessary to develop and supply energy in America. This includes an assessment of supply chains across all energy systems in the United States, a critical way to identify and reform policies that would otherwise drive dependency on China. While much needs to be done to strengthen energy security, establishing this function at DOE makes sense. It updates the department's historic role to assure reliable supplies of energy, to enable energy security. Regarding the other bills before us today, H.R. 8053 expands coverage of DOE's work to secure critical defense electric infrastructure to all 50 states. This sounds like a positive path, but the bill goes farther with additional contracting authorities for DOE, and more needs to be understood on that front. With this and some of the other bills, we have questions about implementation that we're pursuing today. There are expansions of federal programs that seem unrelated to the needed reset on energy policies. For example, H.R. 7947 would create a new $450 million DOE program to prepare homes for weatherization, on top of existing programs. Yet weatherization program was just reauthorized on a bipartisan basis just 2 years ago. What is more, through the infrastructure law, Congress just appropriated $3.5 billion in additional spending on this program, far above what was authorized in 2020. So now it appears DOE can't spend the money appropriated and needs a new duplicative program and more funding. This deserves scrutiny. With record high inflation, should the federal government be paying to essentially flip houses on the taxpayer's dime? We're also concerned with mandates in H.R. 7962. This bill addresses water heater energy efficiency standards, but also requires DOE to examine demand-side management mandates. This is far-reaching and may place control of your water heater in the hands of utilities or other third parties. There are huge implications of this, and we must answer those questions. Overall, I look forward to our witness testimony today. Welcome to Ben Lieberman, former committee staffer, and Lou Pularisi back to the committee. I look forward to your insights and what is needed to reset our economic and energy policy and ensure energy and economic resurgence in the great United States of America. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made a part of the record. I've already introduced the witnesses, and I thank you again for joining us today. At this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. Before I begin, I would like to explain the lighting system. In the front of the witnesses is a series of lights. The light will initially be green. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute left. Please begin to wrap up your statement at that time. The light will turn red when your time expires. Mr. Dulaski, thank you for coming. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for the
I think we have some
opportunity to
slides.
So,
Chairman-
Mr. Dulaski is recognized
Oh,
first
I'm sorry.
remotely. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify on 2 very important bills. These are pragmatic bills that address real problems that face people across the United States.
Mr. Dulaski, you're not being, your audio is not sufficient. Could you turn it up?
How's that working now?
It's better?
Okay. And is it working better now?
It's not sufficient yet. Okay, we're going to turn it up here if you'll wait for a moment. You ready?
How's my audio now?
Okay, please try again.
Okay, I'll start again. Is that okay now?
Not really.
Yeah, why don't we start with Mr. Frias?
Okay, we'll skip this witness initially and start with Mr. Frias. Mr. Frias, would you give us your opening statement?
Greetings, Chairman McNerney, Ranking Member Upton, Chairman Pallone, and Ranking Member Rogers. My name is Rico Frias. I'm the Executive Director of NFOA and a citizen of the Chinande Nation. Thank you all for your time today, as well as the opportunity to talk in support of H.R. 8068, the Tribal Energy Investment Act of 2022. As anyone who has filled their gas tank in the past few weeks knows, the energy industry touches every part of our economy and of our daily lives. We have seen how energy development can transform communities, how it can pull entire regions out of poverty, and how it can shape world events. At NFOA, we know that tribal governments are excited to unlock the energy potential of Indian country, and we believe that H.R. 8068, which permanently changes the ability of the Loan Programs Office to offer direct nation-to-nation loans, is an important step to helping us get there. Indian tribes hold a unique place in our country. They also face challenges that traditional energy development organizations do not face. For example, the status of tribal trust land creates barriers that non-tribal energy developers would not encounter. The change from loan guarantees to direct loans from the Department of Energy removes the impediment of finding a lender willing to fund the project. The lack of access to capital is a long-standing problem, as many institutions have largely shown an unwillingness to work in and with Indian country. Direct loans are also more consistent with the nation-to-nation relationship that tribes share with the U.S. federal government. The treaties are the basis for the trust responsibility the U.S. has with tribes. Permanently authorizing the Loan Programs Office to do direct loans strengthens the nation-to-nation relationship and takes another step in fulfilling the promises the United States has made to tribes. By permanently authorizing LPO to offer direct loans to tribal governments, we're addressing two critical topics for Indian country: energy and economic development. By offering direct loans, we're removing an unnecessary component from an already complex process and addressing the lack of access to capital that tribes and tribal members face. For the future of tribes, it is crucially important that quality, high-paying, and perhaps most importantly, long-term jobs are on or close to traditional tribal lands. This helps solve several of the issues tribal governments face, such as creating jobs that encourage tribal members to stay within their communities, and to ensure that employment remains diversified, so that a downturn in one industry, which we've seen due to COVID recently, would not cause outsized economic harm to the tribal economy. Direct Loan Authority also addresses the lack of access to capital within Indian country. Banks and other financial institutions have for many years failed to work in Indian country. This is why the change from loan guarantees to direct lending is so important. While we encourage financial institutions to work in Indian country, the recent joint notice of proposed rulemaking on the Community Reinvestment Act shows how difficult it really is to bring capital into tribal communities and other underserved communities. One of the major benefits we feel of the LPO Direct Loan Program is that the program, like NFOA, is technology agnostic. We know the benefit of a clean, balanced, and stable climate, as well as the need for energy transition over the coming years. However, while tribes and their members are excited to participate in the new energy industry, they should not be required or asked to bear the economic burden of the energy transition that the broader economy is still economically benefiting from. Additionally, renewable energy projects require a tax equity partner, which adds another layer of complexity for tribes to overcome. It's also crucial for the unique nation-to-nation relationship and for tribal self-determination that individual tribes be allowed to decide which energy sources meet their community's unique needs and economic circumstances. When tribes are given a level playing field, they are able to compete with and even surpass the competition. Permanent authorization of the LPO loan program is another step towards unlocking Indian country's potential for not just energy, but economic development overall. Removing uncertainty around the LPO's authority to offer direct loans will help tribes across the country to compete in the energy industry and ensure that our economy works for everyone. Again, I thank you very much for your time today, for allowing me to testify. I'm available for any questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. We'd like to try again to recognize Mr. Delaski and hope that this time we can follow through. Mr. Delaski, you're recognized.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today, and thank the committee for this opportunity. I'm here today to testify in favor of two very important bills, H.R. 7947, the Weatherization, Enhancement, and Readiness Act, and H.R. 7962, a bill to amend the Energy Policy and Conservation Act with respect to water heaters. I'd like to thank Representatives Tonko and Dingell, respectively, for the introduction of these bills and all the co-sponsors for their support. I'm here today on behalf of two organizations, the Appliance Standards Awareness Project, of which I am the executive director, and the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. ACEEE is a nonprofit 501c3 organization that acts as a catalyst to advance energy efficiency policies, programs, technologies, investments, and behaviors so that all households experience equitable benefits from energy efficiency improvements. ASAP is a coalition project housed at ACEEE that works to advance and defend new appliance, equipment, and lighting standards that cut emissions, that contribute to climate change and other environmental and public health harms, save water, and reduce economic and environmental burdens for low and moderate income households. I also want to recognize organizations that were involved in the development of the Weatherization, Enhancement, and Readiness Act and helped us prepare this testimony. The National Association of State Community Services Programs, the National Community Action Foundation, and the National Consumer Law Center. We're grateful for their longstanding leadership on this program and their work to support this bill's development. With respect to the water heater bill, I'd like to recognize the contributions of the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, the Solar Energy Industries Association, and the Natural Resources Defense Council. We worked in collaboration with each of these organizations during the bill's development, and we also consulted with state governments, other efficiency organizations, and individual utility companies. Of course, any errors in this testimony of commission or omission are my responsibility alone. These bills will improve two of the most important federal programs for easing the burdens of high energy bills on low-income families and delivering large energy savings that protect our environment, improve power system reliability, and improve energy security. The first, the Weatherization, Enhancement, and Readiness Act, would add needed flexibility to the Federal Weatherization Assistance Program, which helps low-income families by making energy efficiency improvements to their homes. The reforms contained in this bill would first raise the maximum amount that the program can invest in any one home, a critical need with wages rising. Also particularly important for rural households that can be more expensive to serve. The bill would secondly increase the amount available to make essential repairs to homes, which are necessary for safe, effective, and durable weatherization improvements. Third, it would raise the cap on solar energy investments for a home allowed under the program. And fourth, it would remove bureaucratic barriers to weatherization improvements. With energy prices on the rise due to the war in Ukraine and severe weather events that can threaten health and safety happening more frequently, such as the severe heat waves of last week, people across the country need Congress to act on this bill. Today, as many as 1 in 5 eligible households is not able to benefit from this program due to structural problems with their home, a hole in a roof, a mold problem. This bill would create more opportunities, more flexibility to address these problems so homes can be weatherized. Reforms in this bill are urgently needed in 2022 to make sure that the lowest income households, many of them rural, many people of color, many elderly, that have the greatest need of assistance can fully benefit from the Weatherization Assistance Program. The second bill would amend the National Appliance Energy Conservation Act, a cornerstone of U.S. energy policy that covers about 60 product categories. The average U.S. household today is spending about $500 less per year on their utility bills because of existing standards enacted under this program. It is one of the most successful programs for reducing utility bills for consumers, saving energy. Standards have also resulted in an enormous reduction in climate change emissions and other pollutants. This bill would amend the law with respect to water heaters, one of the largest energy-using products in our homes and businesses. It would update definitions to clarify the line between consumer and commercial water heaters. It would add a new definition for solar thermal water heaters. And third, it would authorize the development of demand response requirements for water heaters. I want to on this third element. It's a package of amendments, but I'll focus on the third. Demand response is a well-established technique for shifting electricity use away from times of peak demand to times when cheap, clean power is available, thus reducing costs and improving reliability. By heating water when power is cheap and clean, it is possible to save money, reduce demand peaks that can threaten grid reliability, and cut emissions from fossil generation. Historically, some utilities have retrofitted water heaters with demand response capabilities for customers at or after the time of installation. But the capability can be more cost effectively added to products at the time of manufacture. Several states have now established or authorized such manufacturing requirements. This bill would authorize the development of a national demand response requirement that could improve business certainty for manufacturers and for utilities, facilitate broader access to this important technology, and strengthen grid flexibility and reliability. It could ensure a common communications protocol, easing the pathway to large-scale demand response and significant cost savings for consumers. A national requirement would preempt additional states from setting their own requirements, helping to promote a consistent national marketplace for water heaters. Both these bills are urgently needed. You to approve them. Thank you.
Yes, would you please wrap up your testimony?
I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Mulvaney for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss an important topic to our environment and economy. My name is Dustin Mulvaney. I am a professor at San Jose State in the Environmental Studies Department and a fellow at the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. My area of expertise is life cycle impacts, environmental justice impacts of clean and renewable energy technologies and infrastructures, with a particular emphasis on photovoltaics and lithium-ion batteries. I have a PhD in environmental studies and a master's in environmental policy and a bachelor's in chemical engineering. I've been an expert witness at the California Public Utilities Commission for over a decade, and I currently serve on the technical committee for an ultra-low carbon standard for photovoltaics under development with the Green Electronics Council. We are in the midst of a low carbon energy transition, one that is outpacing even the expectations of professional analysts. Growth in photovoltaics, wind turbines, lithium-ion batteries, electrolyzers for hydrogen, heat pumps, fuel cells are all poised for dramatic growth in coming decades. However, many of these same technologies that support rapid decarbonization depend on metals, minerals, and materials that are fraught with supply chain issues, from accusations of forced labor, child labor, geographic concentration, disruptions with logistics, environmental impacts from mining and feedstock processing, and material bottlenecks. Demand for some of these materials often outstrips supply, and that causes price increases and price volatility for key inputs such as lithium, nickel, cobalt, polysilicon, and many others, making the case that the United States would benefit from growing domestic manufacturing and supply chains and lessen dependence on imports. There is a tremendous opportunity to grow domestic industries and reshore supply chains. The United States used to be a major producer of polysilicon, a major producer of rare earth elements. However, while it's critical to develop these resources for clean and renewable energy devices and infrastructures through responsible mining, the only way to do that is first by updating our 150-year-old mining law that has allowed a toxic legacy on public lands to continue to this day. We also need to ensure that we are utilizing waste streams and considering alternative materials. These could be strategic opportunities to mitigate impacts of mining through improved collection and recycling of equipment and devices that contain and could augment supplies of these critical metals, materials, and minerals. So it's notable to see language in Bill HR 1599 that emphasizes improving technology that reuses and recycles to recapture the end-of-life waste flows that would otherwise be landfilled or disposed of as hazardous waste. There's much room for improvement in recycling in recovery rates for lithium-ion batteries, for example, which are not just for the electric grid and vehicles, but also in personal electronics, consumer electronics, cell phones, power tools, and computers. And there are significant carbon emission savings from recovering materials from some of these used batteries as well. Yet most of lithium-ion batteries go uncollected. In fact, lithium-ion batteries that are unsorted is a leading cause of fires at material recovery facilities, often causing local governments millions of dollars in damages. It is also fundamentally important to emphasize incentives and policy that develop substitutes and alternatives to critical minerals as sustainable ways to secure domestic supplies. This would help mitigate extensive impacts from extractive industries, which can be thinly regulated and environmentally damaging. We are already seeing companies move away from cobalt, nickel, and manganese in the next generation lithium ion batteries. And someday we may see batteries that altogether avoid graphite and lithium. There are few specific items in HR 59 as written that raise concern in my read. First, that Section 3 says the Department of Energy will need to increase domestic production, separation, and processing. This is concerning because it suggests DOE would be in charge of mining, permitting, and oversight activities which should continue to be in the domains of the Department of Interior and Environmental Protection Agency. These latter two federal agencies have the expertise and mandate to minimize impacts to lands, waters, and communities. The DOE, for example, has no expertise with government-to-government tribal consultation processes with indigenous communities. And it's hard to imagine DOE developing the policies and in-house expertise to do this work. Second, the language of the bill is very vague with general references to energy and energy systems throughout. The text is not exclusive to critical minerals and makes no mention of low carbon or decarbonization as a goal that could be applied to development of any mineral resources such as natural gas, petroleum, and coal. Failure to be specific here would be sending mixed messages to the markets and undermine efforts to grow domestic low carbon manufacturing and supply chains. Third, I hope that public policies to encourage domestic industries can avoid undermining tribal consultation, cultural resource review, and bedrock environmental laws that have benefited all Americans simply to expedite mining. And finally, and importantly, it is key to realize that without ensuring the entire supply chain is domestic, supply chains can still be vulnerable to disruption. Domestic mining that requires overseas smelting or chemical processing before returning to domestic manufacturing is still supply chain vulnerable to disruption. In summary, we need to be strategic and thoughtful about how to grow domestic industries to build a low carbon economy. Failure to do so will undermine the benefits an energy transition will bring and risk leaving vulnerable and historically marginalized communities behind. Thank you again for the committee, and I look for hosting this discussion, and I look forward to any questions from the committee.
Thank you. Mr. Green, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman McNerney and Ranking Member Upton, members of the subcommittee, my name is Josh Green. I serve as Corporate Vice President of Government and Industry Affairs of the A.O. Smith Corporation, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the water heating industry, as well as our umbrella organization, the Air Conditioning, Heating, Refrigeration Institute. By way of very brief background, A.O. Smith is one of the world's largest manufacturers of residential and commercial water heaters, boilers, and pool heaters, and a leading global manufacturer of water treatment and filtration products. We're publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange and a member of the S&P 500, and we're globally headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin since 1874. We employ approximately 14,000 people around the world at 36 facilities and do business in over 60 countries. Now, as it relates to HR 7962, as the committee knows, this is bipartisan legislation that will provide important updates and clarifications to the definitions of water heating products under the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, or EPCA. And the legislation also responds to technology evolutions in the water heating industry, and which will also provide business certainty for manufacturers, their consumers, and customers. And this is obviously important to us as an industry that and our customers that use our equipment on a daily basis. As the committee knows, Congress established the first national standards for commercial water heaters as part of the Energy Policy Act of 1992. And those statutory definitions are now 30 years old. And though DOE, Department of Energy, periodically updates the regulatory definitions, either by direction from Congress or relying on its delegated authority, subject to notice and comment. Unfortunately, sometimes the regulatory process has its limits, without periodic updates to the statute to ensure EPCA remains up to date with technology, there's a necessary component to updating the statute. And one of the criteria as it relates to the statute is the binary criteria that's currently in law that distinguishes residential and commercial water heating equipment. And those are really just based on the sole energy input of the water heating equipment. Notwithstanding that there are various characteristics that distinguish residential and commercial water heating equipment, such as amperage and voltage, and the end use applications, the outlet water temperature, amongst other things. And we highlighted that in our written testimony. One of the things that DOE did in 2016 in response to some other issues is amend or really slightly altered their regulatory definitions of water heating equipment, and specifically commercial water heating equipment. And what ended up happening is that manufacturers were then faced with a decision to transition commercial water heating equipment that heretofore, for decades before, had been treated as commercial and having to meet commercial standards, to potentially dramatically shift them to meet residential standards. And that would have otherwise created a vacuum in the marketplace, and for some manufacturers to stop producing certain commercial water heaters altogether. And these are products that commercial customers had been relying on for decades. Thus, manufacturers had to transition very quickly, and that caused some uncertainty in the marketplace. And what ended up happening from there in 2017 is that the Department of Energy, along with manufacturers, came together and decided that the best course forward would be to amend the statute so that we don't have the ebb and flow and kind of the regulatory uncertainty relating to these issues. So that put us in a tight position, but over the last several years, we've been working in earnest with a broad set of stakeholders, including with counsel from the department. And HR 7962 is the end result of those efforts. Now, my written testimony addresses some of the more specific updates afforded in the bill, and I'm happy to answer questions on those. But the core components of that legislation are important, and it's really to clarify this definitional line between residential and commercial water heating equipment, taking into consideration the key characteristics that commercial water heating equipment has that is more than just the sole energy input. The other issue in 7962 includes one refinement that was not addressed in previous iterations of the bill, but one in which manufacturers support. And that is language, that would otherwise authorize the department to issue a final rule by December 31st, 2024, that require certain residential electric storage water heaters to have the capability to participate in utility demand response programs, but only if that requirement is technologically feasible and economically justified. This provision represents an opportunity to establish a national standard for a narrow product class of innovative water heating technology that, heretofore, is subject to and increasingly by state regulation. And that, unfortunately, presents some compliance obligations and a quagmire for manufacturers. And having a national standard and the benefits of the preemption that is embedded in EPCA as a threshold matter is better for manufacturers, not only for business certainty, but it allows us to have one standard as opposed to multiple standards moving forward. So I will close with the following. Technology and innovation in our industry have outpaced statutory definitions for the most part. And these definitions are no longer up to date when it applies to commercial water heating equipment. And more broadly, HR 7962 offers a bipartisan and broad stakeholder solution to upgate the EPCA. Once again, on behalf of A.O. Smith and the water heating industry, I appreciate the opportunity to testify on this important bipartisan bill, and appreciate Congresswoman Dingell and Mr. Wahlberg for their leadership in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pugliese, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pallone, Chairman McNerney, Ranking Member Upton, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on these proposed legislative initiatives. We are now in the midst of an energy crisis that may last for years to come. A mix of forces have led to this crisis, including accelerated demand as the world economies rebound from the pandemic lockdowns, sustained underinvestment in fossil fuels, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the impact of government policies on energy markets. Clearly, the Ukraine war has exacerbated this crisis, but these disruptions to our energy systems were well underway before the war began. If I could have the first slide, please. Thank you. As you can see here, rising prices are especially harmful to low-income households. 40% of these households are seeing very rapid increases between 2020 and 2021. 2022 is a nightmare, okay? Next slide, please. Look, we have put an enormous amount of effort at EPRINC in understanding the scale challenges of moving to net zero. But this graphic shows you that in the absence of large supplies of natural gas, we would only have enough fertilizer to feed about 3 billion of the planet's 8 billion people. Large supplies of low-cost natural gas are critical to food security. I'd like to also point out that 4 pillars of modern civilization, cement, plastics, ammonia, and steel, have no cost-effective substitute. Next slide. As you can see here, the rising fertilizer prices are also spiking food costs, and they are also increasing the increase in natural gas with ammonia prices and corn. So we have a kind of perfect storm of rising prices from higher fossil fuel prices. Next slide. Okay. We need a massive amount of critical minerals in order to engage in a rapid transition to the fuels and energy sources of the future. As noted in my written testimony, most of these minerals and materials for the energy system have been sourced outside of the OECD. In this regard, H.R. 1599 appropriately recognizes that the energy transition offers the potential to somewhat insulate us from volatility and supply chain disruptions associated with oil and gas production, but it will introduce a new set of supply risks. It's appropriate that these critical minerals and materials be fully incorporated into the Department of Energy's ongoing responsibilities to bolster supply, to bolster U.S. energy security. Next slide. Yes, any of us who thought that by moving to these fuels of the future, these energy sources of the future, that we would eliminate risks for volatility can just look at what's happening now. In fact, we issued a chart of the week today that looked at nearly a doubling in the cost of the Tesla battery, and you can see that price indices for key electric vehicle battery metals have been just skyrocketing in cost. It's not going to relieve our problems with volatility and supply risks. Next slide. One way to get down gasoline prices is to build out the infrastructure and the capacity of the North American oil and gas production platform. As you can see here, between 2010 and 2020, the United States alone, provided over 80% of world incremental demand for petroleum. And it was in that period that we had extremely low gasoline prices. The North American Petroleum Platform is an instrument, sort of, if you like, a strategic asset for the United States. It's essentially the arsenal of energy security. Next slide. The U.S. is also a major supplier of natural gas, not just to our industry, but to the world market. Right now, if you see the sort of negative sign there is actually a plus for exports. We are exporting 10 billion cubic feet a day. This is roughly equivalent to 40% of European requirements for their import needs for natural gas. And I will find one last slide. Next slide. I know that we are looking for ways to reduce gasoline prices, and probably you're tired of hearing from us on this, but one way that we could take 30 cents off the price of gasoline, much more than a gasoline tax, would be to make a small adjustment in the renewable fuel standard to take it down to close to the market-based level, which would be about 10%. This will take back some of the high compliance costs and other factors in the market that are driving up gasoline prices. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I conclude my remarks.
Thank the witness. Mr. Lieberman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rush, Mr. McNerney, Ranking Member Upton, and members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Ben Lieberman, and I'm a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy institute committed to advancing the principles of free markets and limited government. Before that, I had the privilege of serving on this committee from 2011 to 2018, where I worked on several DOE issues under Chairman Upton and for a shorter time under Chairman Walden. And to all of you who are retiring, best wishes in your well-earned retirements. I'd like to use my time to just 3 of the DOE programs that are the subject of some of the bills being discussed today: appliance efficiency standards, weatherization assistance, and loans and loan guarantees. If there's a common theme, it is that these programs were created to address market failures that have proven to be considerably overstated, and thus the benefits from government involvement are minor and not worth the burdens to consumers and taxpayers. I'd like to start by making a few general points about DOE's appliance efficiency programs, which have been around since the 1970s. It's important to recognize for virtually every regulated appliance, there already are numerous models on the market that go above and beyond the current federal standards, and their Federal Trade Commission energy use labels and the Energy Star program that make it easy for consumers who want ultra-efficient appliances to identify and choose them. But new standards only serve to force that choice on everyone, whether the extra cost makes sense for them or not. One size does not fit all, and we all know our own individual circumstances and preferences better than any DOE regulator could. Not every homeowner comes out ahead with efficiency standards. We've seen that standards have raised the purchase price of appliances, in some cases more than consumers can expect to earn back in the form of energy and water savings. In addition, some standards have compromised product performance, such as those that led to dishwashers taking multiple hours to finish a load. And at this point, most major home appliances have been subjected to 2, 3, 4, 5 rounds of successively tighter standards. So the risk of diminishing marginal returns, or even negative marginal returns, is greater than ever. I'm particularly concerned that these DOE efficiency programs are now being hijacked in pursuit of climate agenda, with potentially adverse consequences for consumers. As we see with the recently proposed residential furnace rule, which might be the subject of a future hearing, social cost of carbon is now being used as a thumb on the scale in favor of new rounds of more stringent standards that threaten higher costs and shift the focus towards environmental goals rather than what is best for consumers. Especially troubling, and again something we see in the proposed furnace rule, is the effort to use these standards to eliminate the option of natural gas appliances, even though they are the best choice for many consumers, since natural gas is generally cheaper than electricity. Simply put, it's not the role of government to dictate choices and tell homeowners what they can and cannot have in their homes. By the same token, I would oppose provisions in HR 7962 mandating demand response capability in water heaters, when many homeowners do not want this feature, and in fact, some would strongly object to it. We need to respect consumer choice, and this measure does not. Demand response is also something that moves us away from the original purpose of the Appliance Standards Program and is yet another example of mission creep towards climate policy. With regard to 2 other DOE programs that are the subject of today's legislative hearing, weatherization and loan programs, I just don't believe we're getting very much bang for the buck. In particular, the weatherization program is one in which economists and others have questioned whether the expenditures exceed the benefits. As it turns out, most homeowners, even many low-income ones, take reasonable steps on their own to prevent wasting energy, and thus the marginal benefit of government programs is limited. In addition, with so much money already being allocated to weatherization programs, I think we're already overspending on weatherization, and therefore HR 7947 is difficult to justify. I'd like to conclude by emphasizing what I think is an obvious point, and that is that the best thing Congress can do right now to save consumers money on their energy bills is not demand response water heaters mandates or free weather stripping or more DOE loans. It's to get these damn prices down. Now, I was working on this committee during a really tremendous transition where we went from very real concerns about America running out of oil and natural gas to this incredible shale revolution. But now we're seeing that revolution neutralized by federal policies blocking domestic energy production and infrastructure. It's time to put energy affordability first, and that can be done by once again unleashing American energy. To the extent that we do want to make changes to DOE programs, the focus should be on reining in the regulatory reach and strengthening the consumer and taxpayer protections in the law. Thank you.
I thank the witness. The chair, we've concluded our opening statements. We will now move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. As we move toward achieving a national zero emissions energy system, securing a domestic supply of critical materials needed for solar cells, wind turbines, batteries, and other renewable components will be a significant challenge. Dr. Mulvaney, what safeguards are needed to ensure that the domestic production of critical materials is done responsibly? And what role, if any, do you think the Department of Energy should have in that mission?
I think, as I stated in my testimony, it's a very difficult challenge, I think, to balance these, our climate objectives and land use impacts of domestic mining. And I think we just really need to make sure that we tighten up a very old law. I mean, the 1872 mining law, is very unclear on, for example, reclamation or legacy mine tailings. And the EPA, is cleaning up many, legacy tailings piles across the American West from, historic mining of public land. So I think that's really important. And I'm also hearing in the public discourse a lot of conversation about how the National Environmental Policy Act is holding up much of mining efforts. And I just don't see that as a valid, not supported by the empirical record. It's protecting the National Environmental Policy Act, and it's the policies that emerge out of that, the Clean Water Act, and some of the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. I think these are really important policies, and they've done very well for the American public to date. So now, as far as the Department of Energy's role, the Department of Energy could help perhaps finance some of these mining efforts if we find that some of these sites which could be justified sustainable mining practices and things like that. Perhaps there are vehicles that the Department of Energy could use, like the loan program, for example, to help develop some of these resources. But I think we're also missing a big piece of this, which is the recycling and materials recovery part. There seems to be in this conversation about securing critical minerals, metals, and materials, just more production and more extraction, when we're really letting a lot of these resources slip through the cracks, and they're getting landfilled and sent to hazardous
Thank you
spaces.
for answering that question. I've long advocated for policies to address the energy-water nexus, which, among many other things, relates to the energy required to heat water in a home. Mr. Delaski, your testimony is focused on the electricity savings that could be achieved by increasing the energy efficiency of water heaters. But can you speak to how increasing the water efficiency of appliances and fixtures in a home or building could also lead to energy savings?
Absolutely. Setting water efficiency standards for a range of products can also drive enormous energy savings because we use a lot of energy in this country to heat water for our homes and for our businesses. Your state, California, of course, has led the work there. The dry West is facing historic drought, and the opportunity to save water is important, not just for energy savings, but also for ensuring that we have water resources to meet the needs of dry West. And standards set by both the Department of Energy and by individual states such as California, Colorado, Arizona, and others are driving considerable water savings today for a range of water using devices.
Well, could you address the alternatives to reducing water waste while people are waiting for the water at the tap to heat up?
The alternative, I'm sorry, could you restate the question, please?
Well, when you turn on your hot water, you got to wait for a minute or two for the water to heat up unless you have on-demand water heating. What are the alternatives to eliminate that waste?
Right. Well, one of the alternatives is to, as you said, on-demand water heaters are an option for that. Another alternative is using recirculation techniques to reduce water waste. But those are two options that I'm familiar with.
My time has expired. The chair will now recognize Mr. Upton, Subcommittee Ranking Member, for 5 minutes to ask his questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. It's always good to be with you. Mr. Lieberman, welcome back. It's good to see you. That is for sure. As you know, NERC is reporting that we are at increased risk of blackouts this summer, perhaps, as I said, even this weekend, as our electric grid becomes more unstable. Baseload power plants like coal, nuclear, and natural gas are being forced into early retirement, with weather-dependent wind, solar batteries taking their place, we hope. Some believe that we ought to stabilize the electric grid with demand response, as we know, which gives the grid operators the ability to remotely monitor and control our home appliances to balance supply and demand. What do you expect the consumer protection and privacy concerns associated with demand response are going to be? I mean, you got to use you should know best of all.
I should know this by now.
Then push the button.
A man's home is his castle, a woman's home is her castle. These should always be decisions made by the homeowner and never the government. It's really as simple as that. And sure, we can save energy if utilities can shut the appliances on and off, but that's not what consumers want. And I should add, I'm not opposed to demand response capability. I'm only opposed to mandating it. Let consumers who want this feature, who think that they can save money with it, let them go ahead with it. But I can tell you as a homeowner myself, this is, I wouldn't want to be a guinea pig in this experiment.
It reminds me of the saying, if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. I get some nuts. Do you think it ought to be mandated by the federal government, or should it be a choice then?
I think that's the problem. It shouldn't be mandated by the federal government. There's very real privacy issues here. Also, when I hear about this scheme, it strikes me as very convoluted. I really question whether it can work as well as some are hoping. It absolutely has to be voluntary. And to me, I think there's almost a philosophical divide here. There are people here that argue this is such a great idea, we need to mandate it. But I'm the one who's saying if it needs to be mandated, it's probably not a great idea.
Mr. Polarisi, I want to give you the opportunity to address the energy crisis that we're facing today. We use fossil fuels for everything in our economy, from plastics and fertilizer. Your graphs were terrific. What are some of the near-term solutions to record-setting energy prices that we ought to be looking at and focused on? We know about Keystone, and we know about permitting infrastructure needs with NEPA reforms, sending the right signal. But what are some basic things that we ought to be focused on, and what might you suggest that we do?
Yeah, so first, we need to send the right signals to the marketplace. We need to restore the leasing program. We need to give confidence that the North American production platform can have an expansive, cost-efficient expansion over time. And the government is heavily involved in affecting that outcome. We need to permit a lot more natural gas pipelines. The Marcellus, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, These are enormous gas reserves. They have production levels that look like Saudi Arabia if they were oil. We can double or triple U.S. natural gas production in the United States. We can keep our prices low, and we can supply the world. We are, as I said, an arsenal of energy security, but we have to change the policies. We need to give insurance in these constant intervention. I mean, I know you're quite familiar with Line 5. These constant regulatory and political attacks on Line 5, they create risk in the marketplace. People start to wonder, okay, what's next?
Well, can you imagine, for the folks that don't know about Line 5, this is a line that connects the Upper Peninsula with the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. And that line needs to be replaced. There's no question about that. It was built in the late 50s, I think it was, 60-some years ago. But I can't imagine the impact on gas prices in the Midwest if that line was simply cut off and not replaced in terms of the impact at that Marathon refinery in southeast Michigan.
Independent estimates show shutting that line would increase consumer costs by $58 billion.
Yeah.
We can do more for the fuel supply. We should try to get a more national standard for fuel specs.
Let me ask you one more question in my remaining 15 seconds or so. Microchips. We've got legislation that passed the Senate big time more than a year ago. Does this have an impact on energy? If we're able to get something like this back through so we can actually build it ourselves versus rely on China?
Absolutely. A reliable supply of microchips adds a lot to the efficiency of our entire production process. All the inputs into petroleum production, all the inputs into industrial production. So it's a very important supply chain issue.
Yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, full committee chair, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Chairman McNerney. I wanted to start with Mr. Delasky, and I've got 3 separate questions here, so maybe a minute or so for each of you to respond if possible. So, Mr. Delasky, Representative Dingell's bill, H.R. 7962, contains provisions for water heater demand response requirements. Demand response, as I understand, is an important tool to lower consumer bills, fight climate change, and address grid resilience and reliability. So could you talk to us about a minute about the importance of demand response, and especially as we face more frequent weather events, extreme weather events, that place a lot of stress on the grid? How can demand response help with emergency events and ensure grid stability? I don't know if you heard me.
Demand response is an incredibly important resource for ensuring grid stability. As peak demand goes up, and that's happening on a hot weather event, that strains the power grid. It can lead to outages, as we faced risk of this summer and right earlier during this hearing. It also drives up costs enormously. That's the most expensive power, is the marginal power, however it's generated. Demand response allows market to move that demand to another time, and water heaters are natural battery. Why not use that battery to charge up that water heater with hot water when power is cheap and when it's produced by clean resources? That's what demand response programs can do. This bill would make those programs more possible. It doesn't require them, it doesn't mandate them, it simply makes them more possible by allowing for the department to consider setting demand response requirements for water heaters as they're manufactured by companies such as A.O. Smith.
Well, thank you. Let me go to Mr. Frias. The Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program, while well-intentioned, has not guaranteed a single loan in its 17-year history. We know that. So can you describe for us again in about a minute or so the potential importance of this program, why it hasn't delivered on the promise, and whether you think the changes proposed in the Tribal Energy Investment Act will ensure that tribes finally have access to energy project financing?
Microphone.
Apologies. Thank you for the question, Chairman Pallone, and it is a fair question. Looking back at the history of the tribal program, though, it was authorized in 2005, but it was not appropriated for until 2017. And the first solicitation did not go out until 2018. It was making good progress in Indian country and then the pandemic hits. You know, and by comparison, I would say that the NIGC took 3 or 4 years, National Indian Gaming Commission, to have regulations and be set up and to be going and working to regulate Indian gaming. So a year for them to get going once they had staff and funds is a pretty good turnaround. With many tribes working remotely or shifting funds to address the impacts of the pandemic, it's understandable that the program has faced delays in the past several years. I can tell you that since I came on as executive director of NFOA in July of last year, that we've seen strong interest from tribes about this program, interest in meeting with DOE, LPO, the Office of Indian Energy, specifically at our conferences where they're speaking on panels, specifically our spring conference in Seattle, to talk about energy programs. There's interest in energy programs in Indian country, and one of the great things about this program is that it's technology agnostic, right? Whether it's extraction, whether it's renewable, the program will work to fund it, and it addresses a critical problem in Indian country, not just for energy development, but for economic development across the board, and that is access to capital. And so this program is important to Indian country. You know, without the pandemic, I think we wouldn't see the history you're addressing there.
Quickly, Dr. Mulvaney, we're talking now about HR 1599, the Securing America's Critical Mineral Supply Act. Does that meet the standards that we want to see for supporting domestic critical mineral supply chains? Are there any changes to the bill that, so it does not inadvertently contribute to harmful mining practices? And what changes do you think must be made to guarantee the bill truly supports clean energy production, if you will?
I think there could be more specificity around what energy minerals or critical minerals are being supported. I think there are ones that need more attention than others. There also could be more language around decarbonization and low carbon energy systems that help define that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mrs. Roger, full committee ranking member, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, I'm a mom. We recently remodeled my kitchen, our kitchen, and I didn't like my choices of dishwashers. And today, because of what was available, we wash most of our dishes by hand. But I'm going to get back to some of my questions that I think are really important for energy reliability and affordability. Mr. Pugliese, I wanted to thank you for returning to the committee. Appreciate your testimony. Last year, you testified in front of our committee, and you warned. You said that it was important for us to look to the example of Germany and their approach in imposing various top-down policy dictates, shutting down certain energy sources, and the result of being more dependent upon Russia. You noted that spiking energy costs there and elsewhere were a warning for us as U.S. policymakers, and that was months before Russia invaded Ukraine. Americans now see the risk, and we see the impact on reliability and affordability. In the United States, there's been an unrelenting drive to shut down fossil energy with weather-dependent wind and solar. Do you think the policy debate over this rush to green movement would benefit from authoritative information on what is necessary to secure energy resources, including critical minerals?
Absolutely. We need a much better understanding of the risks. By the way, Germany has now fired up its major coal plants, and from the folks we talked to there, their climate program is delayed by at least a decade.
So in the late 1970s, the Department of Energy was organized as a cabinet agency to oversee national energy policy and specifically address energy supply emergencies. HR 1599 provides a new function in the department's core statute to evaluate energy resource vulnerabilities, both for critical materials of renewables and for traditional energy. How do you think that this might be useful in putting energy security back at the center of our debate?
Right. If we move to a set of systems where we are reliant on these critical materials and minerals, we're particularly reliant on foreign sources that are not necessarily friendly, actually might be quite hostile to the United States. We need a careful assessment of what that means to our energy security and the reliability of our energy complex.
Thank you. So we hear from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle in the administration that a move to renewable energy will reduce energy price volatility, which we're all experiencing at the gas pump these days. Is the answer to record high gas prices to increase dependence on critical minerals and materials for renewable energy?
It's very difficult to hide from the volatility of any commodity. The way on our traditional energy complexes, we had a large strategic petroleum reserve. We had an expansive program to expand U.S. oil and gas production, diversified production, not just around the North America, but around the world. These are the features that add to your energy security.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Lieberman, appreciate your testimony. One of the questions I have about the legislation amending the weatherization program concerns taxpayer stewardship. When Congress reauthorized the program in 2020, it allowed for a limited program to help ready homes for weatherization with a sunset and safeguards, such as a minimum investment to savings ratios. We've not had enough time to evaluate the program yet in the bill before us today, but the sunset is eliminated, minimum investment to savings ratios is eliminated, and the whole a new program is added. Do you think this reflects careful spending of taxpayer dollars?
When I look at this new bill, to me, it looks like they're clutching at straws, looking for rationales for more money that don't really make a lot of sense to me, that we have to spend money now on houses to get them ready for spending more money later on. This seems kind of a reach, and the weatherization program is already very heavily funded. I think it makes a lot of sense to see what we're getting for the money that's already been allocated before we throw more that way.
Thank you. Mr. Pugliese noted that behind these drives to fund electrification programs, it actually increases electricity rates and it increases the burden on the poor. Then it disproportionately impacts the poor. Do you think Congress should evaluate risk of expanding federal programs that will raise electricity on low-income families and workers? And I've expired my time.
I think energy poverty should always be a front-burner issue whenever energy policy, climate policy is being discussed.
Yes.
We're already seeing energy price increases more than expected.
Thank you. Let's stay focused on reliability and affordability. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Upton. First, I'd like to discuss one of the bills before us today, H.R. 8053, the Guaranteeing Resilient Installations for Defense Act, or GRID Act. I'm happy to be discussing that today. Worked on pretty hard on that over the last 2 years, and want to thank the committee leadership and staff for working with my office to find a path forward on this important piece of legislation. As many of you know, my district in San Diego is proud to host one of the largest military footprints in the country. One facility in my district, Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, is pioneering the Department of Defense's investments in the adoption of renewable energy and resilient energy infrastructure. Miramar's collaboration with relevant stakeholders and staff has culminated in the design of one of the most innovative microgrids in the Department of Defense. The project constructed a power plant with both diesel and natural gas generation to supplement existing landfill gas and solar power. Also, the station built an energy and water operations center to manage the microgrid and other utility control systems at Miramar. These capabilities have already demonstrated their value to the local community as well. In the summer of 2020, the microgrid was used to assist local communities by preventing rolling blackouts during a heat wave, proving its utility on a larger scale. I'm confident this experience informed the written testimony provided by the Department of Energy today when it stated that this bill would, quote, address the significant security disadvantages for facilities located throughout the United States. The microgrid at MCAS Miramar enables the installation to use on-site renewable resources and power generation to supply its critical base loads when utility power is not available, and when the microgrid system is grid connected and utility services are available, the system reduces costs for the base. The air station's success incorporating renewable energy solutions into its electric grid provides proof of concept for the problem the GRID Act solves. It It provides the Secretary of Energy, in coordination with the Department of Defense, to enter into contracts and agreements to improve the resilience of defense critical electric infrastructure and reduce the vulnerability of critical defense facilities to the disruption of the supply of electric energy to those facilities. I wanted to ask Dr. Mulvaney, in your testimony, you note how the GRID Act enhances national security. Can you elaborate on how you believe investments in the resilience of defense critical infrastructure and possible investments in local electricity infrastructure improves national security?
Yeah, I've spent time looking at issues related to ratepayer and very sensitive to cost issues. So, it was nice to see in that bill that as proposed that the Department of or at least the federal government could potentially be investing in local communities to enhance grid resilience. We have quite, thinking particularly from the California perspective, we have quite big challenges on our plate in the state with wildfires and moving power to where it needs to be on certain days because of those wildfires. So I think making those investments and making sure that the lights stay on as consistently as possible are really key to national security, and they help the rural communities that also live in and around these bases also keep the lights on, which is, I think, critically important for national security and human well-being.
Maybe the benefits to an average household from that kind of strategy.
I'm sorry, could you repeat one more time?
Elaborate a little bit more on the benefits to an average household of that kind of strategy.
Well, electricity costs are, in California, are some of the highest in the country, and having investments not be rate-based by the utility, but instead coming from outside will, I think, help lower those bills or keep them where they're at, keep them from increasing, which, electricity infrastructure is expensive, and we have a very old electricity system that we've connected all of us together with and have, given us so much benefit, but it's time for us to start upgrading it and modernizing it and giving us the ability to, isolate parts of the electric grid, for example, when these power outages are. So that would be another benefit to these communities, is that they actually are able to go through these hot days. We just had, for example, in the Santa Cruz Mountains, near where I live, we had this whole Stanford campus was down on power. It was 100 degrees yesterday, and it was because of a relatively small wildfire going right in and around the transmission line. So, we gotta reinvest here.
Thank you, Dr. Mulvaney. I appreciate it, and I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Chairman. And Mr. Pillarisi, let me just ask you a couple of questions. We're doing a hearing today. We're kind of in the middle of an energy crisis. A lot of people don't understand why we're in the middle of an energy crisis. 2 years ago, this was not a problem. Today, it is a serious problem. It's hard to tell from the bills that we have in front of us that we are taking this seriously. And we don't have, has been pointed out by our ranking member Upton, we don't have the Department of Energy here, which is really a shame, because we should be able to ask them questions. But what's your opinion of the bills that we're considering today? Are they going to be able to address this emergent crisis that we have in energy in this country?
Many of these bills, particularly I guess 1599, can be very helpful in addressing problems that will emerge over time. But this is not the critical problem facing the country. We are not going to move through a transition as many people expect. Fossil fuels are embedded in the U.S. and the world economy. They come with a lot of favorable characteristics, particularly the density and the cost effectiveness of their use. And so it will be very difficult to do a rapid transition. These fuels are going to be with us for years. It just, how they end up costing us as a country is going to depend a lot on government policy. And if we have a policy that seems to think that we can stop the production of oil and gas before the alternatives are cost effectively ready, we're going to be in a lot of hurt.
Well, I think we're seeing that as being evidence that you pointed out, I think on your slide, that some of us are inconvenienced, but some people are devastated by the economic effects of this ill-considered rapid transition. It's almost as if, rather than scientific thinking, it was magical thinking. We can now get our energy from different sources without doing the hard work and making the investments along the way.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we just did some work the other day on biogas, just biogas for electric generation. In order to meet the goals of 2050 under net zero, we are going to have to take what we now dedicate, which is about, in terms of land mass for bioenergy, for power, the land mass of France, and add to it the land mass of Mexico. These kinds of requirements are just enormous, and they're going to take decades and decades to figure out the best way to proceed. The notion that we can do this quickly, in my view, is not just aspirational. It's somewhat delusional.
Well, and I wasn't going to go here, but since you brought up the word delusional, it's delusional to think that you can turn everything off in an industry as complex as the traditional energy markets and then say, oh gosh, made a mistake, just kidding, turn it all back on. It doesn't work like that. These investments take time, they are capital intensive, and right now you don't have the economic climate that's willing to make these long-term investments when the federal government has acted in the way it has.
It's a serious problem, and we're going to have to rethink it.
Mr. Lieberman, I was so grateful you mentioned the point at which on this committee the consideration was we're running out of natural gas. Energy Policy Act of 2005 was predicated on the fact that we have to import natural gas from the North Sea because we didn't have enough. We're running out of the feedstock for fertilizer. And how policies that really were developed in this committee. So we are capable of that type of deep thinking. Policies developed in this committee actually led to an abundance of natural gas after the fracking and the shale revolution. So it is disconcerting to see people willing to absolutely discount what had worked when we knew we were getting into trouble, as you pointed out earlier in the last decade, and then to completely undo it with no thought from where we backfill this supply.
Absolutely. The transition when I was on this committee was incredible. There was bipartisan concern that America was running out of oil and natural gas. Along comes the shale revolution, and some of the changes in the 2005 energy bill facilitated that to an unexpected abundance. Now we're seeing that abundance under threat. One thing that Mr. Pugliese mentioned was the tremendous amount of natural gas bottled up in Appalachia, just a couple states away from states like New York and into New England that desperately need it, but the infrastructure isn't there. Most of the bills today deal with giving the Department of Energy more regulatory authority and more spending authority. That's not what we need. We need BTUs being made in America and being shipped to consumers.
I couldn't agree more. So they don't have to buy them from Russia, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Well, thank you, Chair, and also the Ranking Member Upton for holding this important hearing. Reliable and affordable energy is critical to both families and businesses, and the key to ensuring that we have reliable, stable, and affordable energy is to invest in domestic clean energy production, domestic supply chains, advancing new technologies, and making our grid, businesses, and homes more efficient. I'm also pleased that we're talking today about critical minerals and their supply chains today. It's vitally important that we proactively work to establish a domestic supply chain for critical minerals. If we're to build a cleaner energy future and wish to be truly energy independent, we must ensure that the entire life cycle of critical infrastructure is made here in the United States. With that said, Dr. Mulvaney, can you expand on how we could design a system at the federal level or incentivize better recycling of critical materials?
Well, I think in general, with a lot of these electronic products, they're not prohibited from going and entering to landfills, for example. We don't have national electronics recycling policy. We have hazardous waste policy. But I think if we were to have a comprehensive program like some states do in recovering all electronic products or trying to do what they can with that, I think that that could go a long way to augmenting the supplies that we're going to need.
You know, a second important piece of this puzzle will be developing new materials to replace rare critical materials. Can you talk about how we can help companies who have innovative technologies get into the market?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure I have the full set of solutions there, but I think that we need to reward companies that are being more material use efficient. So for example, solar panel over the last 10 years uses 10 times less silver in it than it did a decade ago. And that's because silver is expensive. So companies have that internal motivation. But imagine what the savings would be if we started having a system where we recognized that companies that could avoid silver altogether, for example, would be rewarded in the marketplace. And I'm not sure what the specifics of that would be, but that I think is the general concept there, is to reward the most materials innovative companies that are making new products.
Thank you. Weatherization can have a large impact for individual families, both in the short and long term. And in the city of Pittsburgh that I represent, we have a lot of older homes, and the utility bills for families can end up taking a large percentage of their income through no fault of their own, but because they have a leaky house. So, Mr. Delaski, can you expand on the importance of the Weatherization Readiness Fund?
Absolutely. Based on data from programs around the country, local programs like the program in Pittsburgh and others in cities and rural areas around the country, about 1 in 5 households, the weatherization professionals go into the home and they can't do their work because the home is in such disrepair that if they were to do insulation or ceiling, it could be damaged right away. Say you have a hole in the roof, say there's rotting floorboards. So 1 in 5 homes are in that state of disrepair where you can't provide the service. And of course, these are the homes occupied by the lowest income residents of these areas. Just to tell one story that we came up with. This is from Aberdeen, Washington. This is a home where a partially disabled man, a senior citizen, was deferred from weatherization because of extensive rot in the floor. And then a state program helped him repair these issues on his floor. And then the contractor, the weatherization contractor, could then come in and do the weatherization job. And as a result, his annual heating bill was reduced to $700 a year. This is a home built in 1912. This happens time and time again for the program. So it's really critical that the programs be able to do the basic repairs so that you can go ahead and insulate. You can go ahead and do the weatherization that still has to be cost effective. Still has to be cost effective to deliver those services. So it's really important to be able to do the repairs.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, I thank my friend and the chairman for yielding, and also thank our witnesses for being with us today. Mr. Pilarsi, if I could start questions with you, and I've got so many questions and so little time. The first chart, one of the charts you showed was Figure 2, which is the world production depends on fossil-based fertilizers. And this is kind of an interesting chart because my mom was raised on a farm. My wife was raised on a family farm. And back in 1965 on this chart, is showing about just a little over 1 billion people being able to be fed and where we are today. And I look at that, interesting, because in 1965, my grandfather was 65. And so it's interesting to see where we've gone in that short period of time. And, my concern is when you look at these numbers that you show us, that 3 billion people, are dependent on, where we are, that if we don't have that fertilizer, depending on the 8 billion with the mixed diets, what's going to happen if we don't have these fertilizers out there in the future? Because, again, this is absolutely critical for survival of the population.
Yeah, we're just going to, we're going to have starvation and spike prices. So I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think particularly the developing world, they are not going to move to a system in which they don't use ammonia or fossil fuels to make fertilizer. Now, the question is, maybe you could do some of this with carbon capture and things like this, but the rising cost of this is likely going to see resistance. These countries will, I don't think the political leadership is going to permit them to not grow food.
Well, and again, because what we're seeing in Ukraine this year, with they're not bringing out maybe 65% of their crop, and then they got to get it out to market. But then in your figure 3 shows the rising prices, because again, that's going to affect everybody, not only in this country but around the world, what the prices are going to be. Because I know a lot of people saying, well, prices are up for farmers this year, but the problem is going to be the cost of production is so much higher than it was last year. So I think it's critical. Again, another figure that you have was on, and it was brought up just a little bit by Mr. Doyle. But when you're looking at, rare earth minerals, this is your figure 4, and when we need these minerals, and when you're thinking about, especially where communist China is in supplying rare earth minerals across the globe today, we talk about being able to recycle batteries and things like that, but we've got to have these things today. So where do you see in the near term? Because again, we had testimony here. It might take 10 years to get a mine open in this country to be able to get these, if we could get the mine open.
Yeah, right.
So what's your projection when you look at these numbers across your figures here? What's going to happen in the near term?
So I think the risk, one of the risks that we have to understand that we face is that if we try to transition too quickly to these alternative technologies, we're going to substitute an energy security situation in which we are actually relatively secure if we take the right measures, to a set of circumstances in which we will be relatively insecure because some of these folks making these critical materials, unless we have supplies here at home, are not friendly to the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Lieberman, I introduced legislation a while back that, the discrepancies between energy standards based on when a furnace, central air conditioner, heat pump is installed versus when these appliances are manufactured. Can you talk about the problem of stranded inventory and how regulations can better be tailored to avoid this problem?
Yes, some of the standards have the regulatory deadline as the point at which the product must be installed, rather than a drop-dead deadline after which you can't manufacture a certain product. And when the installation date is the deadlines, that means some legally manufactured air conditioners or other equipment can no longer be installed. And that means that if it's at a warehouse, if it's at a retailer, it's no longer legal, and so you have stranded inventory. So I do like the idea of moving away from using the installation date as the deadline. Again, many of these wholesalers, retailers, they're small businesses. They're struggling with supply chain issues as well. We want to make sure they're not stuck with inventory that they cannot sell. I would point out that we need to be more broad about this, because DOE regulations are just part of the story. There's EPA regulations as well that can create the risk of stranded inventory. So I am familiar with your bill. We need to make sure that it's comprehensive. I would make one point that one of the reasons for using the installation date is to prevent a run on the older models before the new models take over, which is sort of an indication that consumers wanted the older models, and that's worth keeping in mind. We want DOE standards that don't deprive consumers of what they want.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank you for holding this hearing, and including H.R. 7947, the Weatherization, Enhancement, and Readiness Act. I also thank you for your commitment to protect and strengthen DOE's Weatherization Assistance Program. This program is essential to supporting low-income households, especially during a time of increased energy prices. But we know even before these recent energy increases, many Americans were struggling to pay their bills. And low-income families have a disproportionate energy burden, a higher percentage of their income being used to pay their energy bills. As many as 1 in 5 Americans reported reducing or foregoing necessities such as food or medicine to pay an energy bill. That's unacceptable. So the Weatherization Assistance Program plays a critical role in helping these families, and it works. Homes receiving assistance save on average of $372 every year. But despite this great work, we know the program can be improved. I want to focus on 2 important provisions of H.R. 7947. First, the bill would raise the average cost per dwelling unit from $8,000 for fiscal year 2022 to $12,000. This is the limit on how much assistance a home can receive. The ACPU has not been adjusted at a rate to keep up with recent increases in the cost of building materials, restricting the services households receive, and putting pressure on WAP crews' wages, which are included in the ACPU calculation. So, Mr. Dulesky, can you help us understand why, at this moment, an increase in the average cost per unit is indeed appropriate for this program?
It's urgently needed for this program. With the increase in wages that we're seeing across the economy, this is affecting the programs and their ability to be able to hire and to retain workers to deliver weatherization services. These are skilled people who can move on to other jobs if they're being paid adequately to do weatherization services. So the rise in wages is one factor. Another is the cost of materials. I think this committee is familiar with that the cost of materials are going up in the construction industry, of lumber. These costs and other inputs, these costs are going up, and the program hasn't kept pace with the changes in cost to deliver these services. In addition, I would add that the homes that are in the worst, have the greatest needs, programs aren't able to provide necessary services with the caps that exist today. So this doesn't. Increasing the cap is absolutely essential to being able to provide services to homes. I'd also add that rural homes can be expensive to serve as well because the technicians, the service providers, have to travel further to provide those services. So for substandard housing in the rural parts of the country and rural districts, it's super important to increase this cap.
I thank you, sir. And second, many Americans who would benefit from the program the most are unable to receive assistance due to their homes, as you indicated, being in such poor conditions. These homes are passed over by the program. In some areas, this might be as many as 20% of eligible homes. So, Mr. Dulesky, do you believe it undermines the goals of the Weatherization Assistance Program that families living in the worst conditions have the greatest difficulties accessing the assistance?
Yeah, it's ironic, and it undercuts the very purpose of the program. The people who most need the services can access them. The program provides tremendous benefits to the homes that are able to be to those families. But for the 1 in 5 who they come into the home, they want to provide the service, they assess that there's the need, but then because of problems like a hole in the roof, or because of rot, or because of mold, they can't do the insulation, they can't do the ceiling. And these are the people who most need those services because they live in the most substandard housing. And those are homes in our urban cores, they're homes in the rural areas, they're homes throughout the country. And these are the families who we most need to be able to serve with the weatherization program. And the way the program's structured today, these houses are deferred. In other words, they're not served. And that's a huge problem.
Well, the dedicated readiness funding, which may support structural improvements like bad roofs and addressing environmental hazards like mold and help lead to better outcomes, certainly for the traditional weatherization program, and provide hope for those households that have been passed by. So I appreciate your comments, and with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, here we go again. After spending a year and a half on partisan messaging bills like the Clean Future Act and Build Back Better, Pelosi seems to be trying to avoid losses in this fall's general election by trying to appear bipartisan. Look, as Chairman Upton said a minute ago, inflation is at a 40-year high. Gas prices are over $6 a gallon. Opioid crisis continues to grow exponentially, and frustrated Americans are increasingly turning to violence. So instead of actually working on those matters, this majority is nibbling around the edges. And last night, the president announced his support for a 3-month moratorium on the federal gas tax. Really? This is nothing but a politically motivated gesture. Does anyone really expect the trucking companies to pass on those savings to the consumers? And with the suspension, a typical motorist will probably only save $7 to $10, $7 to $15 a month. That's about the price of a pack of cigarettes or a couple gallons of milk. But let's return to today's hearing, because that's what they want to talk about. These bills are well-intended. I understand that. But, Mr. Chairman, these bills will not increase our domestic infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and its production and lowering prices. This committee should be talking about issues that matter to Americans now. So, Mr. Puglisi, if I could ask you a couple questions. If you were his advisor, would you tell the president, or would you be advising the president to suspend the gas tax for 3 months?
No, I think, as President Obama said, it's a gimmick.
Thank you. And according to Reuters, countries around the world are increasingly reverting back to the use of coal, as you mentioned in your remarks, for power generation because it's cost-effective and avoids rising natural gas prices. So if other nations are doing this, continuing to use coal, and let's call it clean coal, would energy reliability in the United States benefit by our using clean coal technology?
Absolutely. We should have a very robust and diversified energy source for generating power and other uses for energy throughout the national economy.
Thank you. And Mr. Lieberman, if you could just pass the magic wand that did one thing to lower gas prices at the pump, what would that be?
I would try to travel back in time and try to get candidate Joe Biden to not say he wants to kill off the domestic oil industry. I mean, talk about a chilling effect, and we've seen that ever since. One can complain that the oil industry, the refiners aren't investing enough, but can you really blame them when the commander-in-chief is using that kind of extinction rhetoric, or at least was until prices got too high? Plus, as we know, the president has made good on those promises starting from day one. One point I would also make is that, sure, Keystone XL pipeline, drilling in Anwar, these would take time to come online, but a number of economists believe that expectations of future supplies has a beneficial effect on current prices. And then the alternative, expectations of future supplies being cracked down upon because of federal policy, has an adverse effect on current prices. So I think there's a lot we could have done that would have lowered gas prices much more than the 18.4 cents per gallon federal tax.
Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Puglisi. What would you do if you could just pass one thing? What would be the top priority to lower gasoline prices?
Well, in the near term, I would take the renewable fuel standard down to 10%. I could get 30 cents right there. I would ask the administration to take emergency procedures to give us a national RVP standard for gasoline. I would probably also repeal the Jones Act, at least temporarily, so crude oil and products can move at low cost from where they're produced to where they're needed within the United States. These are all very difficult things to do. I fully understand that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Washington State, Ms. Schreier, for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Frias, under the current statute, the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program permits the Department of Energy to guarantee up to 90% of a private sector loan. And I wanted to dive into that a little bit. The first question is just, has the private sector been willing to finance tribal energy projects?
Thank you. You know, in Indian country, we experience difficulty accessing capital across the board. It's as I mentioned in my comments, you know, the joint NPR about the Community Reinvestment Act addresses some of the difficulties we have in bringing institutions, bringing capital into Indian country. I believe one of the members talked about how capital-intensive energy programs are. And so it's difficult for us to get capital in Indian country. Increasing it is a constant struggle. And you know, studies have shown that institutions are reluctant to lend for economic development programs where they don't have a pre-existing relationship. The tribes that will have those pre-existing relationships are tribes that perhaps have built gaming institutions or other forms of economic development. But the reality is, the tribes that are most in need of economic development are those that don't have it now, and perhaps are not well situated to be involved in the gaming industry.
And do you have any sense of what sorts of energy projects tribes of various tribes were looking to finance, just for some examples?
You know, again, as I said in my testimony, we're agnostic about the technology at NAFOA, and I think you will find tribes that are on all sides. You'll find tribes that are very interested in renewable energy. You will find tribes that are very interested in doing extraction. I mean, that's one of the strengths, I think, of this program, is that it is technology agnostic. It doesn't favor one over the other, but allows tribes to have that authority in their own sovereign hands. Tribal leaders to be able to make the decision for what works best for their community. And so we hear interest in a broad array of different projects. I think, but for the pandemic and the effect that it had, you know, not just in Indian country, but in the country as a whole, we would have seen further progress.
And are these energy production, or can this also be energy distribution projects? Because the ones you're talking about sound like they are really highly capital intensive if they're energy production.
You know, I believe it's in favor of energy production.
Okay.
But I'll have to go back and take another look and make sure. If I can
That's
get back
okay.
to you with a firm answer on that.
Thank you. No, I'm trying to work through, you know, why this loan program has really failed Indian country to date. And it sounds like that is the reason that having this new system where we don't have just a loan guarantee, but direct loans from the Department of Energy will make such a difference for Indian country. And then I think that may be that may be the end of my question. I mostly wanted to kind of get you to point out what the failing was with the prior system and how this could make things better. And I think you've explained that this will allow for money to flow to tribes more easily. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
Yes, if I could reemphasize, Congresswoman, you know, funds weren't appropriated for this program until 2017. So while on paper it appears that the program has been around for a long time, it was around without funds. And so the first solicitation didn't go out until 2018. And then 2020, the pandemic hits, and we have this reallocation of funds in Indian country. We're all looking at different things. Indian country was hit, I think, in some ways harder than other parts of America due to multi-generational families and multi-generational homes, and other factors. And so, but for the impact of the pandemic, I think we would have seen further progress. I think this change is really important because it takes out a really complicated extra step that we don't necessarily need.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Pugliese. Thank you for your responses to my colleague, Mr. McKinley, in regard to what we could actually do to lower the price of gasoline for consumers. And I would have to agree that a number of those would work, particularly the expectations. As you said, Mr. Lieberman, when you have the President of the United States first as a candidate and then on day one saying, we're not going to have any more drilling, we're not going to do the Keystone XL pipeline, how can you then expect those folks who normally would do the exploration, the drilling, the investment in new equipment, new refineries, as I understand it, and tell me if you've heard this as well, our refineries are actually operating at about 93, 94%, which is about as good as you can get. Is that your understanding too, Mr. Lieberman?
Yes, it is. And one of the things refineries are struggling with is CAFE greenhouse gas standards for vehicles that will essentially require electric vehicles. So there's regulations that would constrain the amount of gasoline that can be used in the future effectively. And that raises questions about whether investing now in more capacity would be worth it.
Yeah. And somebody used the term delusional earlier, and I would concur with that as well. All right, let me switch gears and let me go to something different. Let's talk about the weatherization. Now, Mr. Lieberman, I like weatherization a little bit better than you do based on your earlier comments, but I am concerned about this repair or reconstruction of a home before you get there. And I know that the bill has on page 4 a limit for average cost per unit basis, but in some parts of the country, and that may include parts of my district, if the home is in disrepair, you might hit that average cost based on prices in more expensive areas of the country. The average cost might actually mean that you invest more money in the home than the home is actually worth, even after repairs. Can you comment on that? Should we have something in there that if we're going to do it? I know you don't like the program that much, but if we're going to do it, shouldn't we have something in there that says that it should be a percentage of what you expect the home would be worth after you've done all this work on it?
Yes, I think that would be a good safeguard to improve the bill. I will say generally about the weatherization program, and this is just anecdotal evidence, there is a fair amount of waste that goes on. I think something less than 100 cents on the dollar has been spent wisely. A lot's been spent on the program. One would think that much more wouldn't be needed to be spent if the previous amounts were allocated more wisely. I don't know the specifics of your particular question,
Right.
But again, I think with the tremendous amount of funds that weatherization is already getting, I think there ought to be increased oversight.
Right, I agree with that. H.R. 5292 on the agenda today is a common sense bill. I support that. It deals with making sure that if somebody has gotten a DOE loan in the past, that and they've defaulted, they can't get another one. Do you think we should also say that for not only, Mr. Lieberman, not only for DOE loans, but for loans of any type from the federal government, that if somebody's defaulted in the past, they shouldn't be eligible for a new DOE loan? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. And then I want to move on to something that I think is significant, and that is I think we probably also ought to have civil penalties for federal employees who knowingly and willfully violate the law, because that's what I believe happened in the Solyndra situation. Everybody heard about the $527 million that was spent in Solyndra. That isn't what got my goat. My goat was the $95 million that was given to Solyndra subsequent to their default on December 1st of 2010. And when the code specifically says, I'm reading right now from the code, the obligation, that would be the DOE loan, shall be subject to the condition that the obligation is not subordinate to other financing. And in that case, I believe that some parties at DOE decided to subrogate the law and disregard it because the law clearly said after default there weren't supposed to be any more monies. They then came up with this plan to subordinate $75 million, which cost the government or cost the people $95 million to outsiders. They did so with a series of emails back and forth, and one of the requirements on default was that you talk to Treasury and Department of Justice. When this scheme came forward and they mentioned it to Treasury, Treasury actually sent an email back at the time that said, hey, we don't think you can do this. Maybe you should check with the Department of Justice, but they never checked with the Department of Justice. I suspect that's because they didn't want to find out they weren't allowed to do it and have somebody from Justice saying that. Don't you think a civil penalty added in there if somebody willfully and knowingly violates the federal law passed by Congress? Don't you think that would help improve the DOE program as well?
That would make for a better program than without it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Lieberman and others.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing today. The Weatherization, Enhancement, and Readiness Act would also make crucial improvements to the Weatherization Assistance Program, helping more families lower their energy costs while making their homes more energy efficient. In addition to the benefits that consumers will see on their bills, weatherization and energy efficiency play an important part in our efforts to fight climate change. Mr. Delasky, can you please elaborate on the climate benefits of the Weatherization, Enhancement, and Readiness Act? Mr. Delasky?
Thank you for that question. Absolutely. Saving energy in homes, whether it be the weatherization program or other programs such as the appliance standards program and others, are effective policies for reducing energy use. And that helps to lower consumers' utility bills. And where power is being generated from fossil generation sources, that helps to reduce climate change emissions.
Okay, can you please talk about how the Weatherization Readiness Program proposed in the Weatherization Enhancement and Readiness Act complements the Weatherization Assistance Program? What gaps does this bill address?
Right, it addresses 4 important gaps. One gap is that it raises the average cost per unit to $12,000 so that you could actually do the projects that otherwise would be outside the scope of that cap. The second thing it does is that it allows the program administrators, the local weatherization assistance programs, to do basic repairs to homes that allow the weatherization work to be done. Absent those basic repairs, often the weatherization can't even be done.
Okay.
Those are 2 of the ways that it improves it.
Sure. One of the bills before us today takes important steps to modernize standards that govern water heaters, which are one of the largest energy users in our homes and businesses. By making simple updates, we can encourage more efficient and responsive technology, saving consumers money and reducing our energy consumption. But we know other outdated or inefficient consumer technology throughout our homes is not keeping pace. Mr. Delasky, can you talk about the relationship between household appliances and consumer technology and our energy consumption? Moving forward, what options do we have to ensure our standards are keeping up with technological advancements?
One of the most important ways to make sure that the tech is for us to update the appliance standards administered by the Department of Energy. The department has a legal obligation to review standards periodically to keep pace with technological change. And it's the typical new refrigerator sold today uses 25% as much as it did 20 years ago. It's huge technological progress, and that progress is driven in large measure by increasing standards.
Sure.
And that ensures all consumers, whether they're buying an entry-level unit or whether they're buying a deluxe unit, get a level of performance that lowers their energy bill and lowers the emissions that result from using that appliance.
Okay, thank you. I've long believed that the investments we make in critical infrastructure not only supports our economy, but enhances our national security. This is especially true for the infrastructure within this committee's jurisdiction. Dr. Mulvaney, can you discuss the relationship between local electricity infrastructures and national defense? And how can we balance the need for needed upgrades with a cost burden on ratepayers?
Would you
Dr.
mind
Mulvaney?
repeating that one more time? I'm sorry.
Oh, can you discuss the relationship between local electricity infrastructures and national defense? And how can we balance the need for needed upgrades with a cost burden on ratepayers?
Yeah, so a lot of our military infrastructures and installations are obviously around in rural communities, and these are often sometimes they could be co-ops and not even major parts of our major utilities in the state, and they can often be burdened with very high bills. And it sounds like from the context for the bill that these infrastructure upgrades are needed for national security to make sure that these critical infrastructures are up to speed in terms of the most secure facilities, and that they have the latest gear in there and all that stuff. But that's expensive, and when a co-op or even a utility has to build those infrastructures, the ratepayers have to pay for that.
Right.
So in terms of, so there's a couple ways to protect low income customers. One is you have outside investment help that, and that can be supported by the government, but you could also have programs to protect low income ratepayers. Meaning, like California has a law, has the California
Thank
care
you very
program
much,
allows them
Dr.
to
Mulvaney.
layer
I'm out of
roads.
time. Time. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Next up, Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Well, here we are, right in the middle of this preventable, in my opinion, intentional energy crisis. $5 a gallon gasoline in rural Appalachian, Ohio for my constituents means having to choose between food, medicine, getting to your job, taking the kids to school, or driving to take an elderly loved one for some hospital care. And what does President Biden and his administration have to say? Well, they say just go out and buy an electric car and join us in this, and I quote, incredible transition to green energy. I mean, our Treasury Secretary actually agrees. She recently said, and I quote, the critical thing is that we become more dependent on the wind and the sun that are not subject to geopolitical influences. How ridiculous. Excuse me, Madam Secretary. Mr. Pugliese, I can't believe we need to clarify this, but can you please explain how critical minerals and metals for solar panels and batteries and the rare earths to make specialized magnets for wind power generation and electric motors are very much subject to geopolitical influences, not to mention subject to the whims of our geopolitical adversaries?
Well, until we developed domestic or more secure supplies from reliable trading partners, we're going to find that many of these critical materials and minerals are sourced out of China, the Congo in Africa, and very unreliable sources, which would be in a position to not only generate a great deal of revenue for the sale of these products to the United States, but also to withhold them or to extract wealth from us by charging prices well above market levels.
So basically, we're going to be making ourselves more dependent on some of the worst people in the world.
I believe without the proper measures, we could end up taking a position of relative energy security to one of energy insecurity.
Let me pivot for a moment to this water heater legislation regarding so-called demand response technology, which I think is better described as the capability to remotely control the American people technology. I don't know about you all, but my constituents would be extremely concerned if an outside entity, say the power company or the EPA or the Department of Energy, at the push of a button tells them, sorry, you got to take cold showers today because the grid is overloaded. Friends, the solution here is to make policies and implement policies that make electricity generation more affordable, more reliable, and more abundant, not look at ways to micromanage household energy use. So, Mr. Lieberman, you mentioned it briefly in your testimony. Can you describe to us the concept of, I quote, forced demand response? And can you explain why, without effective guardrails, could you see this expanding beyond water heaters to other home appliances and perhaps even electric vehicles?
Well, yeah, there are some very legitimate concerns about privacy here. What this program would do, essentially, it strikes me as trying to make up for the intermittency of wind power by allowing extra wind to be used to heat your water when it's available, or extra solar, and that would require turning on the water heater at that time. What strikes me is it's really getting away from the consumer focus of the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which is supposed to save consumers money and do so in a way that doesn't compromise any product performance, features, reliability, choice. The more I learn about this program, the more, maybe cockamamie is too strong a word, but at least convoluted. I just don't believe that it could ever happen in a way that wouldn't be a lot of problems for consumers. And in any event, if any homeowner wants to go along with this, more power to them, but we need to prevent this from being mandated. And, you know, in response to maybe the argument, well, this doesn't mandate it, it gives DOE the option of mandating it. Well, you know, maybe I'd be impressed with that if this was my first week in Washington, but we know that regulatory agencies always take every opportunity to expand their power, and so this will mandate the demand response capability.
Yeah, well, I thank you for your comments, Madam Chair. I yield back. It's mind-boggling to me that we're even talking about something like this.
The gentleman yields back. Thanks for the gender promotion.
Sorry, I thought my colleague from Florida was still in.
It was that new
I didn't
haircut.
even look
It was
over
that new
there.
haircut of his.
That's all right.
The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. This is a very timely hearing because we know that our neighbors are really grappling right now with the higher cost of energy driven by Putin's unprovoked war in Ukraine, the squeeze put on by oil and gas companies because America's continued addiction to oil. So we have got to invest in our energy infrastructure to lower costs for families and at the same time tackle the climate crisis and protect our communities from the costly impacts of climate change that we can no longer avoid. So we're making progress. Many of the bills we're discussing today will help advance clean energy and lower cost energy efficiency, from equitable access for weatherization to expanding the use of distributed energy sources for demand response, for a more flexible, innovative grid, to ensuring the resilience of our military installations. I want to thank Representative Peters especially for the GRID Act that's focused on innovation at DOD. You know, think about how our national security is reliant on consistent energy, but to fulfill those critical defense and strategic missions, we have got to ensure that energy supply to those bases is continuous and reliable. I have a base in Tampa, MacDill Air Force Base, and we're very concerned about, over time, the resilience of that base and energy supply. But let's talk about a flexible grid with more renewable energy, because more efficient electric space and water heaters will save Americans money on their electric bills. We have the technology to do this. Some of these arguments are like from 20 years ago. We can't do this in America. We can do this. We have the innovative technologies to do it. So, Mr. Delasky, help us understand how water heaters with demand response could help facilitate a more flexible electric grid. What is demand response? You've heard it criticized here today. And why are water heaters well suited for it?
Thank you for the question. Water heaters are very well suited for providing demand response services because, in essence, they act as a battery. All of us, or most of us, have a water heater in a home that's got 40 or 50 gallons of water in it. We aren't using that water on a continual basis. We can heat it up when power is cheap, and we can reduce our bills tremendously if we have that capability in our water heaters. One thing I want to point out is that it's much cheaper to add that capability at the point of manufacture than to retrofit it once that water heater's been installed. For utilities, had a truck out to someone's home to retrofit a water heater is hundreds of dollars. Doing it in a factory so that it comes equipped, so that customer has the choice. They don't have to join a demand response program, but we want them to have the choice. This bill gives the consumer the choice, if acted on by the department, if the department takes advantage of the authority, would give consumers the choice to be able to participate in demand response programs if offered by their utility.
Mr. Green, what do you think?
Thank you, Congresswoman. To be very short and efficient and candid here, from a manufacturer's standpoint, we've been involved in both pilots as well as DR programs with water heating equipment for the better part of a decade. And while these programs are nascent, they're all voluntary. What we're really asking for as manufacturers as relates to technology innovation is standards that we all can meet. And just having the water heater have the capability, and therefore giving a consumer that may want to enter into a DR program the ability to do so. For us, it's all about business certainty and manufacturing to a national standard versus bespoke standards that may be coming into the future.
So innovation, lower energy bills for consumers. This makes enormous sense, and I'm a little confused why our GOP colleagues are criticizing this today, because still on their website today, they are highlighting our bipartisan work in 2015 to ensure energy-saving grid-enabled water heaters continue to be manufactured and sold, a solution to facilitate greater cooperation and save money. So we need to move these bipartisan efforts forward and focus on real solutions to lowering consumers' energy bills. I know we can do it, and I'll yield back my time. Thanks.
The gentlelady from Florida yields. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Bouchon, is recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased we're coming together today to discuss concrete actions we can take to help bolster our energy infrastructure and deliver reliable, affordable, and clean energy to our constituents. However, I must emphasize my disappointment in the majority's unwillingness to discuss some of the most pressing issues facing my constituents and our constituents on the energy front. Last week, gasoline prices climbed to over $5 a gallon nationwide. In my home state of Indiana, Hoosiers are paying on average $5.11 per gallon for regular gasoline and over $6 per gallon for diesel. My constituents are also facing the potential risk of rolling blackouts this summer due to insufficient grid resource capacity. And this isn't my opinion. This is according to MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and also some utilities in the region. Our constituents are hurting from the Biden administration's ideologically motivated energy agenda that puts the goals of the radical environmental groups above the needs of the American families. As has been said many times in this committee by my colleagues and I, this is a dangerous approach that will significantly hamper our ability to reliably and affordably meet our energy needs moving forward. Some countries around the world are already experiencing dramatic reckonings resulting from such an approach that's being proposed by the administration and are being forced to take drastic action literally as we speak. For example, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Austria recently announced intentions to bring back some coal-fired power plant generation due to their inability to meet energy needs with intermittent renewables without Russian gas. Who would have thought that the Russian gas would go away? You have to have capacity yourself. This may put them back at the starting gate
when it comes to decreasing their carbon emissions and their climate goals over time. In fact, some politicians in Germany are now discussing openly, publicly, the possibility of overturning the country's 2017 ban on hydraulic fracturing or fracking to increase the domestic supply of gas. Wow, what an idea. We should think about that in some of our states here in America. Why would America, with our own vast resources, follow down the pathway we're witnessing in Europe? We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. So, Mr. Pugliese, when I questioned you before a joint hearing of the Environmental and Energy Subcommittees last fall, you said that we could affect prices if we ensure that our domestic oil and gas industry remains efficient and produce at capacity. So prices are continuing to rise. What are we missing out on here?
I think part of the problem, of course, was that the lockdowns, in my view, were excessive, and they resulted in a lot of our supply chains being disrupted. So we had a real problem coming out of the lockdown. But we also have a real problem on expectations, as Ben had spoke about previously. I'd like to point out one thing. Recently, President Biden visited Japan, and the two
And I was just there too myself.
Yes, Prime Minister Kishida and the President issued a lot of joint statements. But when it come time to make a joint statement on the importance of LNG exports and the importance of more investment in U.S. oil and gas, only Prime Minister Kishida was on that statement. President Biden refused to join him in calling for more investment in U.S. oil and gas. We need to kind of change the dialogue. These investments in oil and gas production infrastructure, they are long-term, they require regulatory certainty, and they require investment certainty, and we don't have that right now.
Yeah, I mean, on my recent trip to Japan with some other members, bipartisan, the Prime Minister told us, and his people told us the same thing. You know, when we were talking energy policy, they wanted to be partners. And they're completely dependent on imported energy, as you probably know. And they want to be partners with us on LNG and other sources of energy. They're desperate to work with us on these issues. Absolutely. So the rolling blackouts looming in Indiana and elsewhere across the country are there. I mean, it's also for you. How can we increase grid resource capacity to minimize the possibilities of power outages? How do we minimize that? I mean,
we have not invested enough in the grid, and we have not invested enough in systems that can back up and provide reliability for intermittent power. And there are a lot of ways to address this. Some time ago, I spoke to Chairman Chatterjee when he was chairman of FERC, and I said, why don't we have everybody bid firm power? Let the solar folks, the wind folks, come to the table with 24-hour power, and at least we would have some price discovery. We don't really know what the cost of intermittent power is, because it's not the same as baseload power. It's a different product.
Understood. I yield back. Thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schrader, for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, Oregon's a good state, too. Mr. Delaski, my question pertains to Congresswoman Dingell's bill to create a new demand response system for residential water heaters. Do you envision that the provisions regarding demand response capability for hot water heaters could rely on the internet as opposed to in person only?
So some programs that exist today in states such as Oregon and Washington and others do rely on being able to consumers can opt into programs where they can gather information for example, for a water heater to respond to a price signal, so that the water heater knows that when prices are low, it's a good time to charge up, and then when prices are high, it's a good time for that element not to be activated. So yeah, that information would travel over the internet to know what's happening with prices in real time. So yeah, technology has advanced tremendously, and being able to use the ability of real-time knowledge to make for a water heater to decide when it's going to operate is a benefit that could be achieved through a well-designed program created by utility.
That could be a win-win, save money for the consumer as well as the utility and rates overall. Do you expect such demand response technology to be open standard or proprietary?
So there are 3 states now, or a number of states that have set standards on manufacturing, and they are generally requiring an open standard. And that would be part of what would make sense as the department considers doing a national standard. One of the benefits that we see in having standards is that they would be open standards that would allow any number of market participants to participate in that market to provide demand response services. So there's not proprietary and not controlled by anyone. So that we get competition in the market. That's the objective of an open standard.
Yeah, because otherwise it could be extremely costly to the utilities, the ratepayers, and kind of confusion in the marketplace for the consumer that thinks they can hook up and have that demand response that you alluded to earlier. The Department of Energy is supposed to determine the economic viability and technological feasibility of these demand response technologies. Do you expect such technology to be put in place here in the short term, next year or so?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of states that have requirements today, including up and down the West Coast, and a number of states have created authority for standards to be required as well. So that's already starting to shift the markets and creating a range of requirements on manufacturers that are coming in the forth at different times, different details. The technology is there today. I think the question is, do we try to normalize this and have a national approach, or do we let it go state by state?
Very good, very good. Yeah, no, it seems like the sooner we move to some uniformity in that area, the better off we'll all be. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Well, the gentleman from Oregon yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. While I'm glad we're discussing some of the bills today, I know our time could be better served by addressing the energy crisis happening across the country. Today, it's been reported to me the average price of gasoline in Michigan is $5.13 a gallon. In Washtenaw County, in my district, where University of Michigan is, the situation is even worse, with prices hitting nearly $5.23 a gallon, which is 30 cents higher than the national average. My constituents are struggling, and as members of the Energy Committee in the House, we need to be doing more to address this issue, because it is, as some of my colleagues have said already, is impacting people's lives, literally, with choices that they shouldn't have to make, that are really life-changing choices. There are some good bills before us today, as I said, but the scope of the challenge calls for much more. It's unfortunate that the Republican legislation that would help alleviate high prices at the pump, like the American Energy Independence from Russia Act, the Strategic Production Response Act, and My Pipes Act, are not up for discussion. That being the case, Mr. Pugliese, in your testimony, you outlined that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the impact of government policies on energy markets. Can you talk about that misunderstanding and how it has led to higher energy prices, and how can we transition back to a more realistic approach to energy policy?
Right. I think one misunderstanding is the scope and the scale of the energy transition. It's much, much harder than most of our analysts and much of which the government believes. This is a worldwide problem. Even if the U.S. were to go to net zero, and all our OECDs were to go, all our member countries in the OECD were to go to net zero, in the absence of a transformation through Asia Pacific and the rest of the world, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 2050 would probably be about 20% less. So the real issue here is that economic growth and prosperity, human development, is going to take a massive commitment of continued production of fossil fuels. And the United States is blessed with extensive resources of oil and gas, but we have made a lot of mistakes. We have not provided the infrastructure, the regulatory programs to allow the infrastructure to build these resources out and to make energy more affordable for the American people.
Yeah. Yeah, and hearing comments that Americans are addicted to oil and fossil fuels. We're addicted to success. We're addicted to a good standard of living. We're addicted to future opportunities. And I don't think most of us mind doing away with fossil fuels if we have something better. What we want to have is our continued lifestyle in the United States, which benefits the world. Turning now to the legislation before us, last Congress I was co-sponsor of an early version of H.R. 7962, which aims to fix an Obama-era regulation and modify the definition of water heater under the energy conservation standards. This has been a long process, and I commend the stakeholders for continuing to work together to come to an agreement. I'm also a co-sponsor of the current iteration. However, there are still some questions that remain which may impact my continued co-sponsorship. Mr. Green, the current version of the legislation has some new language involving demand response, as we've talked about, for residential hot water heaters. Why was this provision necessary, and how does your company and the broader industry feel about its inclusion?
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg. The industry does support the language as a threshold matter, number one. Number two, the language was inserted based upon stakeholder input from the prior iteration of the bill in working with one particular stakeholder, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, and deriving language that would help maintain the ability of consumer choice for electric storage water heaters. The DR language, demand response language, is more about manufacturers coming together and having the department have one national standard on the capabilities that the water heater would have to have. Not that there is mandatory enrollment in DR programs, but just so we as manufacturers have one standard to manufacture to, rather than bespoke standards around the country.
Okay. Well, thank you. My time has expired, and I have other questions I'll submit for the record, but thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got so much I want to run by. I need 30 minutes, but I'll do the best I can. I just want to point out some things, and for the record, I'm tired of the Biden administration trying to put blame on others for the energy price increases. I want to say for the record, the price increases are not the result of the pandemic. They're not the result of Putin. They're not the result of profits. They're the result of policies. And until the administration adopts policies that will change the situation, we're going to continue to see energy prices go up, and they're going to have a devastating impact on low-income households and households on fixed incomes. We see it played out day after day. We've seen it in Europe with their mad dash to convert to renewables. We've seen it manifest itself in some ways that a lot of people don't think about. There's numerous reports out about excess winter deaths. Excess winter deaths as a result of low-income individuals, people on fixed incomes, not being able to afford the price of heating their homes adequately. This is not freezing to death. This is people with cardiovascular, respiratory illnesses. And we're talking about 20, 30,000 now being reported in England and Scotland and Wales and places like that and all around Europe. So there are consequences for these actions. It's not just economic consequences, it's across the board. And I'm really, frankly, tired of listening to this administration try to blame the pandemic or Putin or energy company profits for a problem that they have themselves created. And Mr. Pugliese, I really appreciated the graphs that you put up. I would like to see those graphs, but you laid out a visual for where we are in terms of our energy policy. The other thing that I want to point out is, and I think both you and Mr. Lieberman have commented on this, is the importance of the natural gas reserves that we hold. We will never run out of natural gas. I mean, just a few years ago, they were predicting that we're going to run out of everything, but we will never run out of natural gas. We will never run out of oil. And the thing that I want to point out in this, again, this push toward renewables, you build a natural gas facility to generate electric power, it will have a generating life cycle of about 60 to 65 years. You build a next-gen nuclear facility, which can use spent fuel rods that retain 90% of their energy, and that facility will operate for 100 years. I mean, you can only imagine the technological advances that will occur in that 60 to 100-year period. But you build, if you rely on solar or wind power, those facilities have a life cycle of 25 to 30 years, and on the wind power, the turbines start losing generating capacity after 10 years. And I want to add one other thing. To get the same power generation from that you can get from one next-gen nuclear that can be sited on 640 acres, it would take 70,000 acres for a wind power facility. So people need to understand what's going on here. And we can come in here and we can ask questions. You start talking about the materials that we're going to need, and a lot of times we start talking about rare earth elements, but we're talking about iron, we're talking about copper and others that are not rare earth. And you got the Biden administration wanting to utilize the Defense Production Act to increase the mining and production of these metals. But at the same time, the administration is using regulations to block it. I mean, this is what we've got in this administration and the policies that we're getting from the Democrats who have the majorities in both houses of Congress. Policies that are going to drive our economy into the ditch, policies that are going to result in more excess winter deaths, policies that are going to increase the number of Americans living in poverty because inflation is off the rails and will continue to go up, and no policies, no sensible policies, no sane policies that will get us going in the right direction. Now, I know I'm supposed to come in here and ask you some questions. I'll send you some in writing. But I just think that we need to have clarity in this discussion, and I'm going to repeat it for the third time. This is not the pandemic. It's not Putin. It's not profits. It's the Biden administration policies. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman from Alabama yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. O'Halloran, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this meeting today. In fiscal year 22 omnibus, Congress authorized the DOE to provide direct loans through tribal energy loan guarantee programs. My bipartisan bill, the Tribal Energy Investment Act, would extend current law, ensuring tribes have access to capital to invest in energy projects vital to our communities, which create good-paying jobs and renewable energy to the grid and encourage resiliency. Mr. Frias, can you describe what barriers tribes and tribal organizations face when financing energy projects? How does the Tribal Energy Loan Program play a role in lowering those barriers?
Thank you, Mr. O'Halloran, for your question. You know, tribal communities face difficulty getting access to capital across the board in all forms of economic development by removing, and these, let me step back for a second, you know, these projects are complex, and there's a number of components to it. By removing the need for finding a financial institution to fund this project, allowing for direct loans, you simplify the process and make it easier for tribes to invest in energy development and create, as you've mentioned, jobs, high-paying, quality, long-term jobs in Indian country. Overall, there is difficulty getting financial institutions to work in Indian country. The difficulty was accessing capital in Indian country is something that we work on quite a bit at NFOA, and it's why we've made so many comments on the original NPR for the Community Reinvestment Act, and why we are looking at the joint NPR, the Community Reinvestment Act, because getting capital into Indian country is harder than I believe it should be.
Thank you, Mr. Frias. In your testimony, you note that the energy development can transform communities. We have certainly seen that go both ways. in northern Arizona. In 2019, the closure of the Navajo generating station caused hundreds of Arizonans, mostly members of the Navajo and Hopi tribe, to lose their jobs. But other energy projects like hydrogen, hydropower, solar, wind, natural gas present opportunities for significant economic development. I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure this fix is made permanent and tribes have access to the resources they need to thrive in the 21st century energy economy, and also that we take into consideration as these plants close the families and the jobs that are going to go with them to make sure these areas in rural America stay as part of the permanent structure of our landscape. In my remaining time, I'd like to focus on what America can do to secure our critical mineral supply chain. I was disappointed to read yesterday that mining companies, taking a page from the playbook of big oil, are prioritizing stock buybacks over investment in projects essential to securing America's clean energy supply chain. We need a diversified critical mineral supply chain, but some seem to present a false choice, pitting our transition to renewable energy against American commitments to clean water, protecting our lands, and respecting tribal sovereignty. We don't need to compromise American values to build a strong critical mineral supply chain. We need to understand the makeup of that supply chain in the world and become dominant in those areas that are where we are now weak. We need to identify clearly how we're going to strengthen those supply chains and, if possible, bring a lot of that back to America where it belongs. I am committed to working across the aisle to find common sense solutions to ensure we aren't trading with which authoritarian regimes plague us into an energy crisis and instead invest in a future where America is truly energy independent. Article after article after article has clearly identified, and studies, that we are not in the right place when it comes to the resources that we need to both address the challenges our society is facing and to address the needs of a cleaner climate and less carbon future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentleman from Arizona yields. The gentlewoman from Arizona is now recognized for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Arizona time, I think. I want to make a statement first before I ask a couple questions. I really think on HR 7962, we need to remove the demand response system program. I understand that you want a national standard, but from a consumer point of view, I can tell you that my constituents are going to go epileptic if they think the utility companies are going to shut off their water heater in the middle of a shower. And so I think that is a problematic part of it. I have a question for Mr. Pugliarese. In Arizona, we have a lot of mining. And so we produce about 65% of America's entire copper production. There's also another mine in Superior, Arizona, owned by Rio Tinto, where they have invested $2.3 billion. Under the Trump administration, it was given the green light, but 2 months into the Biden administration, it was pulled the plug. And it could produce about 25% of all the copper that is needed or consumed in the United States. We also have large lithium deposits in Arizona. So my question is, how do you think HR 1599, which is Representative Upton's bill, would help produce and encourage mining in the United States, which of course is needed if we're going to move to, wind and solar and EVs?
So I think the bill would permit DOE to identify the importance of these materials. It's not going to fix the Interior Department, right? I presume these mines are on public lands, and particularly in Arizona. And there, unfortunately, we're going to eventually have to reform NEPA. I'm not sure whether the administration pulled the plug on those mines or whether they were acting on a court case. But we're going to have to find a way to develop resources in this country that's meets environmental standards, but can go through a regular approval process rather than endless delays and fighting over a very uncertain set of standards. So in that sense, it's a much more serious reform problem we need to undertake.
And I agree with you. We need to promote not only mining, U.S. mining production, but U.S. Oil and gas production to solve some of our problems and be less reliant on China, quite frankly. My next question is for Mr. Lieberman. H.R. 7947, the Weatherization, Enhancement, and Readiness Act of 2022 creates a new weatherization readiness program to provide grants to state and tribal organizations for low-income residents. I have been a supporter of the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP, which provides federal-funded assistance in managing costs associated with home energy bills. My question is, do you think this bill, this new program established by this bill, would be duplicative of LIHEAP?
It could be. LIHEAP helps pay the energy bills after they've been incurred. Weatherization, if it works right, prevents the energy from being used in the first place. Again, I think the problem with the weatherization program, how much bang for the buck are we getting? How many cents on the dollar are being spent wisely? I think that we're doling out more money after more money after more money without taking a look at what past money has succeeded at and failed at. And in terms of the larger issues, I think if a low-income household had a choice between a completely unweatherized home and the energy bills of the recent past, or a heavily weatherized home, but today's energy prices, I think most would go with the unweatherized home. It would probably be cheaper for them. So we really need to get those energy costs down through more production. That's job one.
Great. Well, I thank all of you for being here and those online and testifying, and let's work together and help America. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I understand that there are members that wish to come back after recess for questions. So at this point, we're going to be calling recess until immediately after votes.
I thought we were done. By the way, you've convinced me. I don't know if it makes any
One from Delaware, Ms. Blunt Rochester is now recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing, and thank you to all of the witnesses for your testimony today. Even though summer officially began yesterday, we are already entering the third week of excessive heat and humidity across the continental United States. These record high temperatures and extreme weather events will continue to put pressure on the country's energy sector, which is why it is more important than ever to work together on legislation that makes our energy infrastructure more efficient, more resilient, and more affordable. Electricity is a necessity to our everyday life, from the heating and cooling of our homes and buildings to the use of important medical technologies. The public health and safety of our constituents requires reliable access to electricity. The demand for electricity only continues to grow. We need to invest and upgrade our energy infrastructure in ways that will help optimize energy and help our country combat the ongoing impacts of climate change. And it is critical that we work together on this legislation so that we can help expand and modernize our nation's energy infrastructure, making it cleaner, safer, and more dependable and more affordable for all Americans. Dr. Mulvaney, the renewable energy transition is a key component of addressing climate change by lowering harmful emissions and providing more Americans with clean energy. Many of these low carbon technologies, however, still rely on critical minerals that need to be mined from the earth. And like many renewable technologies, the solar panel supply chain is quite complex. Environmental technology standards are becoming more common, such as the ultra low carbon, unquote, standard that you are advising through the Green Electronics Council. What would ultra low carbon technology mean not only for emissions, but also for environmental justice communities where residents are already overburdened by mineral processing and recycling facilities?
Thank you for that wonderful question. There are a few ways. First of all, I think to your second point, recycling processes, here I'm talking about advocating for recycling technologies. They are often located in low income communities and have their own environmental justice consequences. So recycling is a partial solution to this, but we have to be cognizant of these particularly heavy metal issues. I'm thinking of Southern California and the Exide facility that left a really bad legacy in the communities there who are still dealing with that cleanup. So we have to be very, very careful about how we site new recycling facilities and where we put these and ensure that the communities and stakeholders are there. And I'll just add one other potential source I think that is missing from the conversation so far is mining and industrial residues. So mining waste, a lot of these critical metals are actually on site at existing mines already in tailings piles. I'm thinking of coal ash as a potential source for rare earth elements. That stuff would be pretty easy to permit, and you could start processing that right away. And another example here, Rio Tinto, major mining company, just expanded their copper mining processing facility to also recover tellurium. Well, tellurium is about 1,000 times more rare than rare earth element. And it's a critical ingredient to the semiconductor technology that the largest manufacturer of solar panels in the United States, First Solar, is using. And they did that by not adding new greenfield mines, but by strategically investing in certain pieces of equipment on their own site. So I hope I answered all of your questions.
You did. Very, very, very comprehensive. I guess my next question to you is that many of my colleagues have already noted that HR 8053, the GRID Act, would address national security threats. Can you talk about how energy efficiency upgrades to critical defense facilities help to combat national security threats?
Well, I think that there are a lot of probably inefficient uses historically of energy on military facilities. So one, I think there's just upgrading that equipment is going to benefit generally the national security, even just kind of new wires, new transformers, things like that, I think are really key there. But also the power of procurement, I think a little bit too. I think we think about using the Department of Defense or government federal investments to kind of spur new industries, I think that that could also be a side effect of these investments.
Great, thank you. And my next question is for Mr. Green, and we only have 20 seconds, so I might have to submit this to the record. So I'll give you some food for thought. We were talking specifically earlier about HR 7962, of which I'm a proud co-sponsor. And my question, which I will ask you for the record, is how can legislation that focuses specifically on residential energy efficiency, such as this bill, help alleviate the growing costs to Americans and help combat climate change? We will ask you on the record. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the time.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. McEachin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for pulling this meeting together. And to our witnesses, I extend you greetings and thank you for your testimony today. Mr. Delaski, your organization works to advance standards that reduce emissions and that contribute to climate change and public health harms. Whether through weatherization or through better appliance standards, what type of financial savings can be realized by reducing energy use, particularly for those of low to moderate income, and what impacts might these savings have, sir?
Thank you for the question. I'll start with the weatherization program. The weatherization program is a proven successful program for lowering energy bills for low-income households. The typical savings or the average savings for a participating household is $372. That's real money. That's real money that matters for households that are making decisions between, how do I pay for my medicine? How do I pay for my medicine versus utility bills versus food? This is an incredibly important amount of savings that makes a real difference. I also want to point out that the program is very cost effective. The data that we have and that I think is well documented is that for every dollar invested in the weatherization program, $1.72 is generated in energy saving benefits. Those are direct benefits. And while those energy saving benefits are important, those same investments are resulting in an additional $2.78 in non-energy benefits that are perhaps even more important for vulnerable communities. This is like lower asthma rates, reduced respiratory illness, money to pay for medications. This is better home comfort. So the benefits aren't just energy savings, are making the homes more safe for the people who live there, who are the lowest income households. The appliance standards program also delivers very large savings for average households. The typical U.S. household is spending $500 less this year on their utility bills than they would be spending if we never had appliance standards. The program works. It has a proven track record of success, and is delivering savings today. Those savings can be increased by improving our standards over time to keep pace with technological change in a cost-effective way.
Thank you for that. So you've spoken today in support of HR 7962, and while this bill would do a great deal, one particular piece I'm interested in is around the creation of a new demand response program for residential water heaters. As we move to electrify as much as possible and decarbonize our grid, demand response will be key. Can you discuss the benefits of demand response as it relates to water heaters, but also what this program, should it be signed into law, could demonstrate about how consumer demand response programs and technologies may work on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We have a bit of a chicken and egg problem with demand response. The chicken and egg problem is that for this program to work for the average consumers, most demand response programs today are directed at large commercial and industrial customers. They're the ones who get the benefit of being able to shift their demand in response to price signals from the utility companies and to save money, to reduce their energy bills. It can be very hard for households to choose to participate in these programs because they aren't designed for them, and in part because they don't provide the scale. So to achieve scale, to be able to get significant demand response benefits, it's important that the technology be deployed in a lot of homes. Consumers may or may not choose to take advantage of it, but we need to ensure what this bill would do is create the possibility for the department to set requirements that would enable large numbers of water heaters deployed in people's homes to give them the choice of participating in demand response programs that can let them opt into lower utility rates. Absent this kind of national requirement, it's a onesie-twosie type of approach to achieving the scale that's needed to be able to let the average consumer take advantage of demand response and take advantage of the lower rates that are available at certain times of day. And those power resources are often the cleanest power resources that are being underutilized during parts of the day when we could be charging up our water heaters.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Mulvaney, the text of HR 1599, there's language that says or directs the Department of Energy to improve technology that reuses and recycles critical energy resources. And you have, in your testimony, noted that at least with regards to lithium-ion batteries, we could do much better. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what would it look like for the Department of Energy to take the direction in this legislation, and what would be the benefits of so doing? And you have all of 20 seconds. I apologize.
No, that's okay. I think either some federal electronic waste law could benefit collection. It spurred collection of this stuff in Europe. Or if the private sector adopted probably industry-wide extended producer responsibility that made sure that the polluter paid for the end of life of their product.
The gentleman yields. That concludes the member questions. I'd like to thank our witnesses for participating in today's hearings. I remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared. I ask the secretary to respond promptly to any questions you may receive. Before we adjourn, I receive unanimous consent to enter the following questions records into the testimony for the record. Okay, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. We have one more member for questions. Mr. Joyce from Pennsylvania, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member Upton for allowing me to waive on to this important subcommittee hearing. And thank you to the witnesses for appearing with us here today. As we have heard from many of my colleagues, America is in the midst of an energy crisis, a crisis that was created by the Biden administration. Each and every day, I hear from constituents who are shocked by the skyrocketing gas and electricity prices that they face each month. What America needs right now is more affordable, reliable, and clean baseload power. Our nation has the ingenuity and the capability to lead the world in this transition. By investing in innovative technologies like carbon capture and hydrogen storage, we can take advantage of the energy reserves beneath the feet of my constituents and keep our coal and our natural gas power plants online. On Sunday, the Financial Times reported that Germany would reopen several shuttered coal plants in order to avert the potential natural gas shortage for the upcoming winter months. Germany will fire up these coal plants despite the fact that the country is committed to phasing out coal by 2030. Meanwhile, its 3 remaining active nuclear plants are scheduled to go offline later this year, and the government has no plans to extend them. Here in the U.S., we're facing a similar sort of energy crisis because we are not adequately taking advantage of the resources that are under our feet, whether it's coal, natural gas, or nuclear energy. My first question is for Mr. Polarisi. Mr. Polarisi, what steps can we take in order to learn from Germany's errors so that we can smartly transition to clean, reliable, baseload power while at the same time regaining our energy dominance?
I think at first we have to have a realistic view about that some of the alternative fuels we're trying to promote now have limitations that are not fully appreciated, particularly by both government policymakers and the public. And in the case of Germany, It's quite clear when you choose a very narrow set of fuels, in this case, they had a high reliance upon gas and wind. Solar in Germany is pretty limited. And it might seem stable, it might make a lot of sense in the beginning, but it's like an investment portfolio. You face a lot of risks when you make too narrow a choice. So we need a widely diverse set of very productive fuels to power our economy.
Mr. Polarisi, I agree with you. I think that you have elicited that we need reliable and resilient and diversified power sources to maintain the power grid. And it's more important than ever as we see an evolving market forces. As more intermittent resources, such as you mentioned, wind and solar, get brought online and more EVs are placed on the road, the grid must accommodate demands in ways that it was never designed to do so. How can we encourage the collaboration with grid operators and utilities so as to better plan for the future and to preserve and promote the resiliency that we need to see in the grid?
So I think we've underinvested in our grid for a lot of reasons. It's been kind of an afterthought. And the time has come now where utility systems and the regional, the transmission organizations, we're going to have to put a lot more money into the grid and a lot more effort in upgrading it and modernizing it so that it can undertake a wide range of fuel sources and generating power.
My final question is for Mr. Lieberman. Your testimony touches on reining in government spending and strengthening consumer and taxpayer protections. Unfortunately, this administration seems focused on expanding federal agencies on the taxpayer's dime while using regulation to prevent unlocking the resources that would actually provide the consumer with some necessary relief. Permitting is a big part of this. Could you speak to the energy infrastructure permitting reforms that might allow the U.S. to unlock its energy potential and bring down the prices that the average American is facing right now?
I remember when President Biden mentioned that there were 9,000 permits that aren't being acted upon, oil and gas permits, and I looked into it and others looked into it, and of those 9,000, there's a number of other ways that the government can actually stop the actual process of drilling, even for permitted projects. There's just so much going on. There's so many different ways to block production, and they're all being aggressively used right now. One thing I would mention is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. The previous administration made some modest but useful reforms to that I think have been largely reversed by this administration. That's heading in the wrong direction. We need to have a much more streamlined permitting process, or the same mines we're talking about today, we'll be talking about them 5 or 10 years from now.
The streamlining of the permitting process is absolutely necessary. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I appreciate you allowing me to wave on to this important hearing, and I thank all the witnesses for your participation.
The gentleman yields. At this time, I request unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record. Number one, a June 21st, 2020 letter from the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute to the Committee on Energy and Commerce in support of H.R. 7962, a June 21st, 2022 letter from the National Community Action Foundation in support of H.R. 7947. Number three, a June 22nd, 2022 letter from the U.S. Department of Energy on the underlying legislation of today's hearing. Number four, a June 22nd, 2022 letter from the National Mining Association in support of H.R. 1599. Number five, an October 14th, 2021 letter from Representative Don Young on H.R. 5292. And lastly, number six, a June 21st, 2022 letter from the Joint Associations in support of H.R. 7962. Without objection, so ordered. At this time, the subcommittee is adjourned. I thank the witnesses.
Yay, Jerry.